Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. This is the day I've been waiting for long and finally. I'm your MC, V. Rajesh Kumar, the Group Manager at Infosys Data Privacy Office. We welcome you all today. Trust everyone is doing well and safe in the midst of this big pandemic. I'm super excited to have you all at the Privacy Symposium 2021, a maiden event which is organized by Infosys Data Privacy Office in collaboration with the International Association of Privacy Professionals, commonly known as to all as IAPP. IAPP needs no introduction, but still will be privileged to talk few words. IAPP is the largest and the most comprehensive global information privacy community and resource. Founded in 2000, IAPP is a not-for-profit organization that helps and defines, promote, and improve the privacy profession globally. The Infosys Data Privacy Office was set up in 2010 as an independent unit within the Infosys group under the leadership of Srinivas Kusrala, who is the Global Chief Privacy Officer. The team comprises of a mix of professionals from diverse backgrounds such as law, information security, risk management, delivery, and corporate strategy. The Global Chief Privacy Officer reports to the group CEO, who is also the member of the board. 3 days, 12 interesting topics, and 28 speakers. I'm sure we are all looking forward to all the amazing conversations and insights we are going to have today and for the next 2 days from our esteemed panel of speakers. Before we begin duly, let me remind you a few things. For the participants joining through our broadcast, you can see two icons on the bottom right side of the screen. One is for the chat window and the other one is for help desk. Any questions you would like the speakers to address can be typed on the Q&A, and we will do all as best depending on the time. We would like the speakers to also address some of these questions during the session. The chat icon can be used to input your thoughts on the topics. So please bear in mind, do not use or type any personal or sensitive personal data on either of these options. These will be recorded and will be made available at later stage. For IAPP members and other members, you are eligible for CPA credits. So let's start. We begin now with our first session, which is a privacy, a key agenda in the board discussion. Increasing data breaches and the huge enforcement actions by regulatory authorities has really shown the way how the privacy should be managed by organizations. So it is no more about just data breaches, but also extends to meeting the expectations of the stakeholders, the customers, employees, vendors, alliances, partners, etc., where avoiding unfaithful practices and behavior during such data collection and processing. So privacy is no longer a nice to have, it is now a must have. So privacy governance is also seen by organizations as a source of competitive differentiation in the marketplace. So this topic is outpacing other key agendas as part of the board's day-to-day concerns. So on this topic, I would like to call upon Srinivas Kusrala, the VP and Global Privacy Officer for Infosys Group, who will be the moderator of the session. To introduce the speaker, Srinivas Kusrala currently serves as the Vice President and Global Chief Privacy Officer for Infosys Group, which includes all its subsidiaries. And he's been associated with Infosys for 20 plus years. Wow, that's great. In addition to his vast experience at Infosys, he's also an active member of committees, boards, and advisory groups working towards a common privacy and cybersecurity goals. He is also the co-author of the recently introduced ISO 27701 standard, which was published in October 2019, and the BIS 17428 standard on data privacy assurance engineering and management requirements, which was published by the Indian BIS November 2020. Over to you, Srinivas.
Welcome everyone to the Privacy Symposium 2021, which we are organizing jointly with IAPP for the purpose of knowledge sharing. The event that we are doing today is actually a culmination of a series of interactive sessions that we do every year as part of our Data Privacy Day celebrations on the occasion of 28th January we start, and it spans sometimes a few months. However, this time it was somewhat special. Last year, July, we completed 10 years of independent existence of DPO function. So that to commemorate that, we decided to do a little larger scale. We begin this, and in fact, I'm actually going to do a separate session today towards the end of the entire program today itself, which is going to be speaking about the experiences and learnings that I got being a CPO for 10 years in a global organization like this with about 40 to 50 country presence. So this event we today begin with Rajesh mentioned. It's a very strategic topic, which is about privacy in the board agenda. And before I introduce the speakers, I would say that this is very apt time for the discussion, because last week we just completed 3 years of GDPR, and it's time to take stock of. And GDPR is not just Europe; it reflected across the world. So it's time to take stock of key issues that we face today in the privacy world. So for this session, I have very senior leaders from Infosys and IAPP. Deepak Padki from Infosys, who is Executive Vice President, Chief Risk Officer, Chief Strategic Officer. And he's been there in this company right from the beginning of his career, more than 2 decades, brings a vast experience, worked across several functions. And he's our point of contact for the board. He's the one who takes up all the agenda for the board when it comes to risks. Trevor, who is CEO of IAPP, needs no introduction. The entire world community knows, privacy community is familiar with IAPP, the body of privacy in the world. So welcome, Deepak and Trevor.
Thanks, Rini.
Formally, yeah. So before I get to Trevor, what we see today is the GDPR had a profound influence on the entire landscape, not just on the organizational privacy threat landscape, but also it influenced regulations of several countries. Organizations started completely changing the focus on the privacy. They have invested huge amount of effort to gear up their privacy programs in order to mitigate the risks, the threat of the huge penalties that GDPR talked about, and it is something that made a very big impact in the privacy community as well as in the tech community. At the same time, many countries either they enacted new legislation or they revamped their existing legislation in alignment with GDPR, what they call it as a gold standard. Of course, some of them would have done it to get adequacy status, and some would have done to face the challenges that the digital industry is posing. But all this has led to, at the same time, we also had a significant amount of innovation in the digital technologies. The economy is increasingly more than in the past dependent on the digital society, which thrives on data. So the key point that I want to ask you, Trevor, to start with, and then to Deepak, is when we talk of data minimization, the principle of GDPR and many regulations, it's a requirement of the law. But we see that the entire industry, which is based on digital society, consumes a lot of data. More the personal information they get, both from the people or indirectly, more the meaningful insights that they're able to derive about people, which helps them to process innovatively and sometimes even benefit the consumers, but sometimes benefit them. So what do you think in this triad of data subject, data controller, data protection authority, if I can put this triangle, how do we see the balance of power in such a way that we, at the end of the day, empower consumers or citizens or data subjects to the maximum extent? Because all said and done, data privacy law is about empowering people. It's about protection of people's data, right? The controller and authority comes secondary. So what changes do you see is required? Over to you, Trevor, and then to Deepak.
Well, thank you, Srinivas. It is wonderful to have the chance to speak with you today. The IAPP is very happy to be working with Infosys on this event. And hello, Deepak. It's wonderful to be able to share this session with you. So, Srinivas, you started us with the most difficult question that we could possibly have to answer, which is how do we create harmony? How do we create a sense of balance or optimization between our need for privacy and data protection and the insatiable appetite for data in the information economy? It is a massive, massive question. Now, you are absolutely right to mention GDPR. GDPR is becoming, if it has not already become, the global framework from which not only many laws are being designed and built, but also many organizations are using as their baseline foundational compliance structure for all data protection within their organization. And yet, as you mentioned, Srinivas, GDPR is based on many concepts that I think we already begin to see stress and strain involved with them. So, data minimization, consent, legitimate processing, adequacy, and global data transfers. These are all structures that do not seem scalable given the amount of data that is being processed, given the number of data relationships that exist in the complex data environment that we find ourselves today. So what do I see in the future? What do I see coming next for us? I'm actually not sure if empowering the data subject is the right answer. When I teach privacy law at the University of Maine School of Law, one of the exercises that we do when we're working on consent for cookies is we open the front page of the New York Times website and we count the number of cookies on the front page of the New York Times website. And many times we have counted over 40, I think the highest was over 70 cookies on the front page of the New York Times website. That's 70 different data relationships that exist within that one website. And you can imagine that as a data subject, even for me as the CEO of the IAPP, that is too complex for me to understand and in any meaningful way provide my consent. And so we need something that is more scalable, solutions that are more functional, that allow us to enjoy the benefits of the information economy, but do not create massive obligations on the data subject to understand a digital environment that is impossible to understand, and for organizations to build compliance structures that don't necessarily add up to better data protection. I think the best answers in the marketplace today are those associated with accountability, those associated with data stewardship, those that are focusing on ensuring that when your data is being used, that it is being used in a way that is safe, that is trustworthy, that is within the boundaries of the data subject's expectations, but that I as a data subject do not necessarily need to know every single piece of data, every byte of data that may be transferred to any other processor or other relationship that may exist within that data ecosystem. So GDPR, massively important. Data minimization, yes, it's an important principle, and I think that remains within accountability. However, we want all of the benefits of the information economy to make our lives better, while at the same time wanting our privacy to be protected. And I think that means more accountability, more stewardship for organizations in this space.
So you're saying, Trevor, the traditional approach of relying on consent, data subjects' consent, as a silver bullet solution to all privacy problems is not going to help. Organizations have to be made accountable to respect the choices people give, and they have to take accountability regardless of what people do, right?
Yeah, I think that's right, Srinivas. I am not the first person to say that consent is not scalable. It is not scalable, full stop. And so we need additional, better solutions for protecting data in the information economy. Now, there may be places where consent is useful, places where particularly sensitive data is being processed, situations where health or medical information is being used that we very much want specific consent in those situations. However, in the broad information economy, as a broad tool, I think it's pretty clear that consent is not a scalable solution.
Sure. So good point you made, Trevor. Good observations. So Deepak, coming to the same topic, a little more in the context of board, we see that security, the closest cousin of privacy in the board meeting, right? I would think of the adversary, the enemy, if I can call security, is an unknown hacker. It could be an individual, a criminal who's darknet trying to steal data. It could be a nation hacker. Regardless of that, we are an unknown enemy. The entire machinery of the organization, all the employees, board, everybody's fighting with that enemy. I know that's a challenge because always the enemy is one step ahead. You're not able to catch up. The fact is, at least the entire machinery is working together in harmony. Whereas in privacy, the fundamental difference is the adversary is often within the organization. Leaving aside security part, which is one of the requirements of privacy. The adversary could be CTO, could be marketing, could be HR. It could be HR who wants to monitor employees' performance in an intrusive way. It could be CISO who wants to do detection of malware. In that process, intrude into the privacy of emails. It could be CTO who wants to innovate, use in AI algorithms innovatively to, let's say, to nudge on behavior of online users into certain desired behavior, and for a good reason. So all these scenarios are actually aimed at business growth. Many of it is driving efficiency, scale of operations. So how do you think board is going to balance? The same board has to take care of growth, productivity, as well as privacy. What is your view on this?
Thanks, Srini. It's a very pertinent question, and let me also say I'm really happy to be speaking here. And Trevor, you made some great points to set the context here of what's the nature of the conflicts we are trying to go through here, right? And there is no one answer. So even on the aspect of the board, Srinivas, I think what is the role of the board, right? The role of the board is to give direction when there are conflicts, right? When there are conflicting interests, the role of the board is to provide that governance and direct it, not to actually go into prescription of execution, because that's really what the company is doing. So one important thing here is, I feel, for the boards, and I refer back, I was reading about a Thomson Reuters survey done a couple of years ago or 18 months ago, which said that 75% of board members struggle to understand what is the whole thing about data privacy and what is really the conflict that we're trying to resolve. So one of the most important things for boards is, first of all, to understand the regulation, right? And I know at Infosys you were instrumental in educating the board also on even before GDPR came out, what's cooking, what are the directions that this could take. What are the obligations of the company? Is the data in the event that it's a data controller, a processor, or whatever it is, right? So that's the first part, right? I think the board has to understand what's this regulation, what does it mean. The second part is really about understanding the controls in the organization. And like you said, sometimes the cyber security piece is a risk-reward equation, which means I want to take certain risks because the reward on the business side is very great. But when it comes to data privacy from a regulatory perspective, it becomes a no compromise situation, right? It's a compliance issue. And so understanding the controls and the approach to the controls that the organization is taking is equally important for the board. And one of the ways we have done it at Infosys, of course, there's a subcommittee of the board that's focused on this, that has people who have a technology background and audit background, and therefore their ability to appreciate some of these and get into details is a little higher, right? So that's one thing. But even more important than that, I think the board has a role to play in gauging the culture of the organization, right? So today, for instance, if GDPR, just from the sheer quantum of the penalty that could come at you, has caused this to come up to the level of the board, they've absolutely succeeded, right? That just the fear of the penalty keeps this at the top of the agenda in the boardroom. But it's important that a board doesn't view this as a checklist item, right? Like, so I've done this and I've done due care. That's only part of the issue, and unfortunately that can become more pronounced because of the quantum of the penalty, right? That you just need to make sure that you're in a defensive position, rather than the other way around, which is to stress the values and stress, is the company, when it deals with issues, how deep are they getting into what could be private information, what could not be private information, not rely purely on the DPO, for instance, right? Are you going cross-functional? Are you going and looking at cross-functional teams and how they are dealing with data? What is their approach to thinking about data? How loose are they in talking about information when an incident happens, right? So I think this aspect is something that is increasingly becoming more and more important, because if the board is not gauging the culture, then things can go wrong, soon. And one of the other things I want to make, just hitching on to something that Trevor also mentioned, see this whole identification of, let's say, PII as the data to protect, to me is only a static condition, right? If you think it's complex today, I think it's just going to get more and more complex going forward, right? Many times to dumb this down, I think about, in the physical world, how do we protect our privacy, right? If you walk into a store on a main street, everybody knows you went in there. Everybody on the street knows that you went in there. But if you do the same thing online, then it is private information, right? So there's always this conflict, and partly that's because of education. You feel people have over the decades and centuries understood that if you go out in public, you're going out in public. But when you're sitting on your laptop, what is public and what is private becomes more nuanced, right? So I think this this whole thing about only this amount of information has to be protected and everything else is a question mark, probably will change. Tomorrow, maybe transactions will be private, right? Or some transactions, I want to be able to say this transaction, I want everybody to know that I did it. But this transaction is private, not just the data point, right? So I feel that over time, the nature of what is private data could also change, and that will increase the complexity of how you monitor it, and therefore the regulation will also have to keep up with it, and business will have to keep up with it. So I think this is again not an easy answer, but really the board has the role to play of giving the direction when it senses a conflict, and the way to do that is to understand if the culture of the organization is in step.
Yeah, thanks, Deepak. I think at the end of the day, it is about treading cautiously to see which risk can be accepted to what extent in different scenarios, and proceed further. So you also brought this interesting perspective of physical versus digital world. A lot of emphasis is being laid now to educate people in various countries, particularly the ones who are not as digitally literate, in terms of how to create possibly different avatars, different pseudonyms, and push organizations to see that as much as possible, avoid identifying people when not required. So GDPR also has explicit clause on that, says do not identify people when you don't need to identify. Don't collect data. So I think the emphasis is both on users to take precautions and the organizations to be more accountable. So good perspectives you brought, Deepak. So the next point, Trevor, to you is about the very controversial subject on should privacy be free. Is what is the very important aspect that's being discussed all over the world now, and California had brought in a regulation, CCPA, which talks about providing financial incentives to people if they agree to share certain amount of data. We are not talking about data protection, we are talking of privacy here. We have to actually distinguish between the two. You have no compromise on data protection, because you have to protect data because it causes harm to people if the data is exposed, etc. But privacy is about not just protection, it's about choices. To certain people can exercise choice to trade off certain amount of privacy to get some incentive. There are people who do that, and to socialize more, to share, to make their private the photographs public. So at certain instances, and not at certain instances, other instances. So this is I think this can't be solved by one solution. But what we see increasingly is the data has become. People say data is a new oil, but I see that data is actually new, basically a renewable energy, something like solar. You consume data and the data is still there, right? It gets replenished. So under this condition of data being the new solar, we have several technologies, tools, apps, whether it's social media, messenger apps proliferating, many of which offer free service because they consume data as the raw material. The consumers should be aware. Of course, they should be aware, but many seem to be not aware, or they seem to forget. And some stage comes the situation whereby they press that my data is being shared, my data is being consumed in a different way, which I didn't expect. So can we, without getting into being attached to what is right and wrong, what is your view on should privacy be free? Should we? Is there something else we are missing in terms of? Should we say that let the free market economy decide this? Should it be matter of competition law, or do you think still it's a matter of privacy regulators to get in? Because I don't, it's being debated everywhere as if it's a privacy issue, but is it a privacy issue? Is it a competition issue?
Thanks, Srinivas. So again, another very complex and big question. There have been many who have said that if you are not paying for a product, you are the product. And I think that is the case when it comes to many of the services that we enjoy as free services today. You are paying by your presence on that platform, and you are paying by having your data utilized in a way that allows that platform likely to have advertisement targeted back to you, and in many cases have advertising targeted across a broad range of devices and the web and various places back to you. And so the issue of advertising, targeted advertising in the privacy world has been with us for 25 years. I started as a chief privacy officer, as a director of privacy in the ad tech industry in 1999. And I can tell you that the issues that we were dealing with then are the same as the issues that we are dealing with now. The number of issues in the field of privacy associated with ad tech are even more than they were 20, 25 years ago. But here's the challenge. We haven't resolved them. We have built platforms like GDPR, cookie consent. I know all of you have struggled with cookie consent on platforms, and we still have not resolved these issues. We are now seeing large platforms like Apple with the ATT system create essentially do not track resolutions. I think what we are seeing is that society broadly has said there is an amount of tracking that is okay, that is permissible in order to enable these free services to provide their services. And so there is a level of acceptance within the broad marketplace for these free services. However, after some of the abuses that we have seen in the past 5, 10 years, after some of the broad issues that we have seen with things like election manipulation, false targeting, false advertising, certainly the Cambridge Analytica case, even the Edward Snowden revelations with the connection to national security apparatus, there emerged an awareness that the use of our data is going far beyond the expectations of those people who are on social media sites. And so I think those boundaries need to be better defined. I think the marketplace is going to make it very clear that individuals do not want to pay a subscription fee for many of these services that they are currently enjoying. We're paying lots of subscription fees as it is right now for various services. But I think it's very clear that moving towards subscription fees for some of the social media platforms, for some of the other solutions, is going to be very difficult to implement. But at the same time, it's also very clear that some of the most aggressive data practices, some of the most aggressive data sharing in the ad tech industry are also beyond the boundaries of what societies around the world deem acceptable. And so I think whether it is through law and regulation, like GDPR, like India's Data Protection Act, like laws that are emerging in California and elsewhere, or perhaps more consequentially, through the large platforms themselves, like Apple, like Google, like the operating system providers, where they put limitations on data sharing to third parties, we will see the boundaries of that data sharing come back in. Now, that may mean that those companies are less profitable. It may mean that those companies need to find other ways to monetize the services that they have. But I think we are seeing the market evolve so that there are norms associated with the amount of data that is deemed acceptable for use in this marketplace.
And Srini, if I may jump in here,
Yeah, sure.
See, I think Trevor, great points. You talked earlier about the staggering amount of data that's getting generated. See, one of the big differences now is that it's not so much about there's a hypothesis and the data is trying to prove a hypothesis. When I look at companies that are trying to use data, it's not just that, right? So it's about, I don't know what's in the data and I want to go and mine it. And therefore, the need to go and collect more data than you can imagine because you want to get something out of it. It's not like, I have this hypothesis, and so if I go and look at only data X, Y, Z, I can prove or disprove my hypothesis. So one of the things that's coming in the way today is that the regulation is still being formed around this aspect of why do you need this data? And actually the answer is, I don't know if I need the data, but I want the data because maybe there's something there that I can use and monetize, right? So I think that's one of the conflicts that's arising between the business strategy of a company on how they want to use data versus the way the regulation thinks that companies should use the data. And clearly, I think data minimalization is completely at odds with the computing power that we have today, right? When I have AI and ML algorithms that can crunch through so much of data, why are you trying to minimize my data set, right? So I think these are some of the emerging conflicts that are coming out when you talk about strategy versus the privacy part of it.
Sure, Deepak, I think I was about to ask the same thing and you answered the question.
Yeah.
So I will take my next question to Trevor. Thank you for that. Trevor, this is, I think, the last question before we get into audience questions. The Indian Data Protection Bill is in the Parliamentary Committee, and it is likely to be placed in Parliament sometime soon, and then it will be likely to become a law. So we are at the very crucial stage where we feel that while the bill becomes a law, soon I'm sure it will become. So when we see that day, the effectiveness of this depends on the enforcement, how well the data subjects are able to use this. And we are talking about here bodies which will be accountable, both private bodies, public bodies, right? India is mix of public-private situation. So what, in your opinion, based on your global exposure, how we should structure our data protection authority, in your opinion? Should it be in a way that the enforcement becomes effective? Should it be under one of the ministries? Should it be an independent constitutional body? Should it be like a judiciary body? For instance, ICO in UK is under parliament directly, right? So different countries have different way to look at it. So what is your opinion, and keeping in view the democratic setup of the country, India?
Yeah, so thank you, Srinivas. And I can tell you from an IAPP perspective that we, like much of the world, is watching with great interest the developments in India. India is such a massive economy, such a massive player in the global information economy, with IT processing and development happening in India, that it will have an enormous effect on the global data protection landscape. And so the structure of the Data Protection Act and the regulator in India is of interest to the entire global data protection community. With that said, I probably don't know enough about the Indian parliamentary system and the political structures to give a fully sophisticated answer to you, but I can tell you a few things that we do see. First of all, there is no single right answer for how to manage data protection globally. Even within Europe, with the member states of the European Union, the various data protection authorities across Europe are structured differently from each other, even though they all implement the same law, GDPR. We see various different structures, various different formats. We see commissions. Some are funded differently than others. There are many different structures. I think there are a few things that are good indicators of a successful regulator, though. So first of all, independence. You want to have a regulator that is not politically motivated or politically influenced. You want an independent regulator that is pursuing actions based on a prioritization of harms, of societal issues, of things that are significant to that economy, to that market, to citizens within that country. So independence is absolutely critical. Independence of funding is also critical. We do see regulators around the world who are perhaps independent in their ability to bring enforcement actions, but not independent in the funding of their agency, and therefore are subject to political influence through funding mechanisms. So a security of the funding mechanisms for the Data Protection Authority, certainly that has been significant around the world as well. And then the last piece that I will mention is that an empowered regulator is important as well. Enforcement capabilities within the regulator are a tremendous driver of behavior in the marketplace. We certainly have seen laws and regulations which have been passed around the world where there are very limited enforcement capabilities. My home nation of Canada, actually, the Information Privacy Commissioner at a federal level has asked for national enforcement capabilities for a long time. The abilities of the Canadian Commissioner to bring enforcement actions are actually greatly limited, and he does not have independent fining authority. That is a tremendous challenge in the Canadian marketplace. So I guess if there was one thing that I could share, it is that there are many models around the world. There are many best practices. I've shared a few that I think work with you, but there is no single solution when it comes to a regulator or a data protection authority that will give you the result you're looking for. It will be based on what fits best in this market, in this political structure, in this political system, in order to achieve the goals of a vibrant and meaningful law.
Right. So thank you, Trevor, for those inputs. I'm sure the committee will look into what is right for the country, but your inputs are valuable. We'll see what can be done best. We hope to get the best solution. So with a few questions that have come from the audience, I think some of them, as you're speaking, I was going through, have been answered in some form or the other. One of them is when we talk about consent is not scalable, what are different avenues to leverage information economy? So I think, Trevor, you answered this in a way that it needs to bring more accountability to organizations and rather than relying on consent, right? You want to add something on this, Trevor?
Yeah, the only thing that I will add, I like to give this example often. So I am sitting in my office at IAPP headquarters. And when I walk into my office, there's a light switch on the wall. And I turn on the light switch in order to turn on the lights in my office. Now, I am not an electrician. I did not write the electrical code for determining the size of wires and the voltage and wattage and the various things. I don't want to know any of that. I don't want to know those standards, and I do not want to have to consent to them or agree that when I switch on the light, I am assuming liability for possible electrocution. I want the light to work. And that is what we want in the information economy. When I use the internet, when I use technology, I want it to work and to serve my purposes. And I don't necessarily want to know all of the wiring and the codes and standards and licensed electricians that were needed to build that system. That's accountability. That's what accountability looks like in the marketplace. And I think that's a vision for our future.
Excellent.
Trevor, I think. Sorry, Srinivas.
Yeah,
I think the key word is how can organizations build trust, right? Through the way they behave and the way they're perceived. And, for me, even the Apple experiment now on the do not track thing is an experiment to me, because what's going to happen when people switch it all off and then they don't get to discover new products because they're not targeted in advertising, for instance, right? Over time, you will get to know when people are educated and they're saying, this company I trust, this I will consent, this I won't consent. That's the kind of information I want, therefore I'll give the consent and so on, right? So it's a process of education, I think, even for the data subjects, because, you don't know what you want either, right? And you're just going to one extreme at the moment.
Absolutely, you're right, Deepak. So one last question, I think I'll just, for the sake of time, does data privacy also has dependency on data center? That is where the data center has been stored. I'm assuming it's about where the data center is located. So I would add, I would speak and then I speak to both of you. Deepak, you want to try this? I mean, this it's about, I think, localization law.
Yeah. I think it's all intricately connected, right? So today, even regulation has aspects of the localization. So absolutely, there is a dependency. I think it's more for the ability to control whether you're compliant, right? That's the main point.
That's
probably,
I think
Srini, you are better.
Have requirement to store data locally, so that way I think it has dependency, but otherwise it should not be an issue. Trevor, you want to add something? Otherwise we'll.
Yeah, the only thing I'll add quickly is that the issue of data transfers is becoming enormously complex around the world. It is driving more behavior towards localization, to data centers localized. And I will just offer that I don't think that this is as much about data protection as it is about geopolitical power between nations. That there is an effort to drive technological power into particular markets by leveraging questions of data transfer and localization. And so we as data protection professionals just happen to be the soldiers in that broader war. And that's a big challenge, I think.
Sure, I agree. Thank you, Deepak and Trevor, for your views. So I think in the interest of time, we'll stop here. And once again, I thank Deepak and Trevor for joining this fireside chat with me. Thank you, bye. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Over to you, Rajesh. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much, Deepak. Thank you very much, Trevor, and thank you very much, Srini, for excellent insights on the topic. They're quite interesting. So just to as a recap, I would like to bring in some of the pointers, just as a takeaway for us as part of the previous session. One is on the traditional approach of relying on consent, where consent is not scalable. So the mere solution is more accountability to organization. It's one of the perfect example. I think that really strikes the bullseye. And the board's responsibility to give direction, which Deepak was trying to bring, making more compliant based instead of being on a checklist one. The trump card, where this particular data privacy as parts of the key agenda is because of the fear and penalties. And one of the other major issue is the keeping in pace with the challenging, in terms of the nature of the personal and sensitive personal data on the context in which it was initially collected for processing and further secondary users, leading to conflicts in what business wants with what the regulation wants. I think these are some of the key takeaways for all the audiences here. Now, on to our next session. The next session is on one of the key items, the data subject rights. And the title is much more towards organization, where it's how data subject rights is used as a weapon against organization and what are the practical insights on how to handle. Because one of the appropriate safeguards which are enshrined in the applicable local laws and legal rights which are exercisable by individuals and which takes care of balancing the privacy risk in the context of any specific data processing, and this data subject rights is the one which tries to take care of these at the end. Organizations are obligated to make aware of these rights to these individuals and also to explain them how to exercise them in the context when they would like to use them. So this is a challenge for Office of Data Privacy across globes on how to maintain that balance enshrined under the laws on the one hand, but also to mitigate any kind of untoward exposures or non-compliance risks that may forced on the organizations. So for this particular, it's a panel discussion, and I would like to call upon Brian, the Associate Editor of International Association of Privacy Professionals, who will be the moderator of this session. So Ryan is the Associate Editor at IAPP. He's worked on the editorial team at the IAPP for more than 5 years. During that time, he has written for the IAPP daily dashboard newsletters, as well as regional newsletters for Europe, Canada, and the Asia Pacific region. His primary focus at the IAPP is writing about privacy technology. He has also worked previously in publication roles in the healthcare and sports industries. Over to you, Ryan, and all the best.
Thank you very much. Hello, hi, how are you, everyone? I'm broadcasting here live at the IAPP headquarters in the Weston Library. It's a nice sunny day today after a pretty dreary Memorial Day weekend here on the east coast of the States. I'm very happy to be introducing this panel. It's very fitting that we have this conversation today, as last Tuesday was the 3rd anniversary of the GDPR going into effect. The GDPR gave citizens a new slate of data subject rights, including the right to access, rectification, the right to erasure, among others. The GDPR almost essentially let the genie out of the bottle, as other laws, such as the CCPA, for example, have given people around the world similar rights. Even though the GDPR is entering its 4th year, other laws around the world have been proposed and passed. Organizations are still wrestling with these data subject rights and fulfilling these requests. And I'm very happy to introduce a panel who will be discussing this today. So I'll be introducing them now. First, we have the Europe Car Mobility Group Data Protection and Group Compliance Officer, Aurel Blanc. We have Prudential Financial Head of Global Privacy and Global Compliance, Laura Weiss. We have TrustArc Associate General Counsel, Kay Royal. And lastly, we have the Director of Data Privacy for UPS, Sharon Uber. So thank you very much, all of you, for joining today. I'm hoping you're all having a great start to your day so far. So why don't we jump right into it? Ask each of the panelists if you just talk about some of the best practices you've seen in responding to data subject requests, best practices for training staff, best practices for handling these requests in a timely manner, and we'll jump in from there.
Hey, this is Shirin. Can you hear me?
We
Yes.
can, Sharon.
Okay. For whatever reason, the camera does not work, so I was worried whether or not you can hear me. But at least, I mean, you need to imagine that I look fabulous today, and and start off now by trying to respond to the question. Thanks, Ryan. I think one of the best practices for us at the very beginning was know where your data is, right? Because you only can respond in a proper way to what you have, what you might need to redact, what you not can provide to the data subject. But the source of all of that is that you know where your data is. And then for us, if you can imagine, UPS has not only 1 or 2 or 5 systems, we have quite a bunch of systems that keep and process personal data. So it was also a challenge, and then it turned out to be an advantage afterwards to define the asset owners, meaning who can pull you that data. We do not have just one person who is the master of all of the systems that might hold personal data. So I think these were the 2 key things at the beginning: know where the data is and know who you can address. And I think we will come to that later on. We built our own system on how to respond to these requests. But in terms of how to approach that, I think as a thumb of rule is if you can oversee and anticipate whether or not the volume that you need to review and redact is rather low, I mean, then you can provide, and I think that's our best practice, to provide what you have. If the volume is anticipated to be very, very high, you need to find ways of narrowing down the scope, right? And that is where it becomes a bit tricky. And I think the best advice here I could give is preferably you align with the data subject and try to narrow down the scope. If that is not possible for whatever reason, and there might be good reasons for it, but then you, I think, need to carefully think about what the data subject is interested in, and you must not deduct just what might be harmful for yourself if you provide it. And then I think document so that you always can back to your original thoughts and what you have done. I stop here.
Yeah, Ryan, I think Sharon makes all great points, which I agree with, and I think we'll probably delve into each of those a little bit more. But a few other things that come to mind, and I do have to start, I apologize, with the disclaimer you'll hear throughout the day that, of course, these are my views and not the views of my company. But I like, when I talk to individuals at the company that might not be as close to the data subject rights processes that we've set up, what I always like to start with is how important it is that this is user friendly, because beyond the regulatory requirement, I think of this as an interaction with your customer, right? And like with any other interaction, you want it to be simple. You want them to understand. You don't want them to feel that you're withholding or making things more overly burdensome. And so I think how do you create this, what really is a complicated process, and we'll delve into that more, so many moving parts, how do you make it incredibly user-friendly for people? So I think that's always one thing to think about when you're thinking about best practices for these processes that you have to enable. And the other thing, Sharon mentioned so many points, which I agree with. The only other thing I think I'd add is how important it is that when you set up these processes, you have a very clear ingestion point that starts off your workflow, because when that request comes into your company, wherever it comes in, it starts that clock ticking, whether it's 30 days under GDPR or 45 days under California's law. And so you want to make sure that that comes in, not just to someone untrained in a call center that's not going to know what to do with that request, but to the right place where you've set up a process and can move forward from there.
Great, excellent. And I'm glad that we were able to get started. Just a reminder, if anybody watching wants to submit a question, we'll be blocking off the last 10 to 15 minutes of the session to go through any questions that you may have. As Sharon mentioned, and as Rajesh mentioned in my introduction, privacy technology is a big part of the work that I do, and it's a big part of handling data subject requests. The IAPP in our privacy tech vendor report in 2020 added a data subject request category to our document, and since then we've had more than 90 tech vendors list themselves in the report, becoming one of our fastest growing categories in a report that features well over 300 tech vendors. So, and as Sharon mentioned, while some people may decide to use the privacy tech vendors to handle data subject requests, some may choose to build their own solutions in-house, which provides their own benefits and also their own challenges as well. So I'll open it up to the panel again to talk about how data subject, privacy technology can fit into handling data subject requests, and also the benefits of building your own solution in-house as well.
Well, this is Shirin. I might start with the building in-house. I think at the beginning it was really a cost, not cost saving, but the reason why we went for in-house was really a cost decision, I think. We had experienced some advantages, but also maybe some disadvantages. I mean, the clear advantage for us was that we know how our system works best, and so we can define the best processes for that. We did want to avoid that data is pulled from maybe irrelevant systems. We also we were shy, let's put it that way, to give any other vendor access to our data, what is really the core data, right? I mean, the customer, the consignee, the employee data. What might be a disadvantage is that you cannot benefit from the pace of how these solutions might take place on the market. So if we need to change something, that's fine, because we always have the right resources and we can leverage our resources as we want. And if we say that is a priority for our IT guys, then I think we are able to do so. But I'm not sure if you buy it from a vendor, if the pace in the end might play out better.
That's true. And I can jump in and speak from a tech vendor perspective that one of the biggest advantages, and I say this from being a former privacy officer and privacy counselor, one of the biggest advantages of using technology that's built for you is the fact that it can build in the new laws and the changes that might work from it. So, for example, in our solution, it actually builds in the due dates that you might have. And trust me, with over 900 laws, I think globally, a good portion of those deal with individual rights. And so it's really good to have that built-in response time frame that it puts you on a list where you know you have to respond to in a certain time. I will say that one of the complicating factors is integrating the individual rights tracking software, the intake of requests and your database of responding to them, it's difficult to integrate that with solutions that automatically do everything for you. And that seems to be the magic pill that everybody wants. I don't want to think about this. I just want the technology to feed it in, feed it out, and done, and I can be completely hands off. There's a lot of legal and privacy law nuances to all the automation. But yeah, there's pros and cons to whether you use a tech vendor or whether you go in-house. But at least using a tech vendor, you can automatically take advantage of those improvements and the new laws being built into it.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. And you know, there is no silver bullet, to your point.
I wish there was. I'd gladly sell it.
There was, or that would be much easier. Right, but so really, what you have to think about is this is a potential technology stack, right? And what parts of that stack do you need? What parts do you not need? I think for each organization, there are a lot of variables. What volume do you anticipate?
Right.
You know, with regard to data subject requests, because obviously that's going to change how much you should invest in technology versus whether you can take a manual approach. And the manual approach is incredibly labor intensive, time cost intensive. But if you have a really low volume, it may still make sense. It also depends on the complexity of your systems, as well as so many other factors. You know, as Sharon indicated, your risk appetite when it comes to enabling a third party to have access to some of that information. So there are a lot of factors that go into it, absolutely. I would say, you know, even at the onset, it's having just at least a workflow tool of some nature seems necessary, but the build versus buy question, I do believe, is very organization specific.
All right, excellent. Another category of the Privacy Tech Vendor Report, and one that ties into the data subject request, is data mapping. Having all of the, especially for larger organizations, data all in all sorts of different places all over the world can be a challenge, and getting all that information for a request can be very taxing for a company that has so much at their disposal. Can we talk about the importance of having a good, strong data mapping processes in place for addressing these data subject requests? And also, you know, as a panel who has, you know, global reach, what are some of the challenges in answering data subject requests in other languages too?
So I'm thinking I'm going to take the point. Sorry, there is some work in my building, and this is a counterpart to work from home. I hope it wouldn't be too much uncomfortable. So clearly, we are a European company, but we are established in 14 countries. And effectively, we have different ways to receive data subject requests. So through our customer services. And if the client uses this channel, clearly we have a contact point with each country, so we are able to respond to the data subject in its own languages. And when we receive its request at central level, we have some tool which are going to do an automated translation to be able to understand what is the languages, what is the request of the data subject, and just to be able to forward or to put the request in the right channel. So it's a basic processes, but it helps us at central level to understand what is the situation of the client, what is requesting on, and what is. We tried also to test what is the nature of the relationship, because generally when it comes at central level, generally the client could be not really happy, because generally it has already had some exchange at local level.
All right. So one of the other big topics around data subject requests is verification. As under recital 64 of the GDPR, it states that a controller should use all reasonable measures to verify the identity of a data subject. And a particular case that caught our attention at the IAPP came about in 2019 when an Oxford University PhD student contacted 150 organizations using his fiance's personal data. And of those 150 organizations, nearly 25% gave him access to his fiance's personal data. So I'll ask the panel, what are some ways that organizations should handle verifying data subject requests? There's also the question about whether or not how much more information should an organization receive in order to process a request. It's a very complicated topic, so I'd like to hear the panel's thoughts.
Well, this is Shirin. I start with that one. I think you need to be careful because, I mean, you also do not want to gather more information than you need, right? But you also need to save yourself in meeting or in not violating GDPR by giving data to someone that is not authorized to give it. So we discussed that also with some regulators on what the best way is. I think you need to, or in our case, we differentiate between the employees, because if we do get a data subject access request from an employee, we mainly do have means to authenticate that person. We know the address, we know the private email address, so that's not big of a deal because you know who you are dealing with. For customers and consignees, we offer different ways of providing a proof of identity. Be it a copy of a governmental issued ID, and they can black out any detail. It's just that we see the name. We also offer, give us a electricity bill where you can black out things that we don't need to know. We just do need to make sure, and we explain that upfront, that we need to have some more additional data in order to authenticate the people.
And Ryan, I'll agree with you. This is absolutely a challenge because trying to verify someone's identity virtually, if the person attempting to get fraudulent access knows the person well enough, it's easy enough to fake, including if they can log into their account if you use a portal service, which is typically one of the best ways you want. That they have an account with you, they log into their own account, and you can validate them that way. But it also is on a risk-based approach, as Shirin was just saying. So if you don't have any really highly sensitive data, you don't have anything that would cause questions, maybe you take a lesser stringent approach than you would if you had medical data or something along that line. But I guarantee you, I know the social security numbers of my first two ex-husbands and my current husband, and pretty much everything about them, including their passwords and their secret codes. So there's never going to be a foolproof way of doing it, ever. But you just have to be able to assess what your processes are, understand the risk that you're taking, and then again, not actually transmit the sensitive data unless you can 99.9% verify that it is who it is.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would note, to the extent that your organization has, existing controls around fraud prevention and identity management, you need to be working with those stakeholders and those processes. There's no reason why, those controls shouldn't apply here just as stringently, in certain cases even more so, based, just as Kay said, on the amount or type of data that you're going to be providing to the individual. Which is, I would say one of the key lessons learned for implementing these processes is the number of stakeholders throughout the organization that actually play a role, and the number of existing controls you have to embed in your data subjects' rights processes, including those fraud controls.
Agreed.
Yes, and just if I may jump on the topic, just you also need to be proportionate. For example, at the last year, the French Data Protection Authority, in a decision, fined a company because she has kept all the proof of the ID requested in the context of data subject right. So the DPA considered that it was a disproportionate and not legitimate processing activity to keep all the ID just to be able to check data subject request. So it was very strict because even if you have litigation after responding to a data subject, you will not be able to demonstrate that you have collected the ID and did the check. So it's very strict, and you really need to be proportionate because it's a new processing activity, basically.
It's going to be one that it's going to present a lot of challenges still going forward. Orly, I'm going to direct this question to you. It's about a case that came out of the German Federal Labor Court in April, where the court ruled that employees cannot request their employer to provide them with copies of their entire email correspondence or any emails mentioning the employee by name. To sum up the case very shortly, an employee submitted a data subject request for a copy of his personal data that was being processed. The employer provided the employee with a copy of his personal data and some emails, but the employee believed the copy was not sufficient and brought action against his ex-employer, claiming they failed to provide a complete copy of his emails and any emails mentioning him by name. The court ruled the request is not specific enough under applicable civil procedure laws, raising questions about the scope of data subject rights. Orly, could you please give us a rundown of some of the consequences of this decision?
Yes, thank you. I think it's a very good example because data subject right is not a new right. So clearly it already exists under Directive 95/47. So it's not new, but clearly as the GDPR put clearly a highlight on data subject right, it increased the number of data subject requests, and it also increased the usage of the data subject right has like a weapon against some data controller. And in this context, it's clearly an HR litigation. So it is in the context of a former employee. We would like to access to all this email. And this decision brings clarification for the German countryside, because clearly the courts say that it was not sufficient to request all the email which have been sent and received by the data subject. So clearly it means that the data subject has to define what he would like to access to. And it's very important to focus on the fact that the access right under the GDPR is access to data. It's not access to document. And clearly, we have a very recent decision of the Belgian DPA, which took basically the same approach. So it's a very practical approach because the data subject would like to access to this email, but also to every IT log that he let within the IT system. And clearly, in these second cases, Belgium DPA said it was too extensive and that the IP addresses have the log doesn't have any impact or interest for the data subject. And the Belgium DPA also highlights the fact that if the company is able to demonstrate that giving the email could put the trade secrecy at risk, clearly the company was able to do a pushback. Unfortunately, it's very isolated position, and today there is no global position at European level on what is the extent on the data subject right. And I know that, for example, the ICO does not have the same approach, but clearly it gives sense to the data subject right also, because the target of this right is to access to data and not to document and to email, and not to put the data controller in a difficult position in a litigation. It's not a weapon, it's just a right of the data subject, and it has also to be balanced regarding to the cost and for the data controller.
I chime in here, Aurélie, I share your enthusiasm, but I think it's not. I mean, absolutely. When I heard and read this judgment, I really also had this sense of hope inside myself. But I think the court still missed a chance to really judge and take the decision on the core, because I mean they rejected it for, as you mentioned, for formal reasons. And unfortunately, there was not this what I think everybody or a lot of companies would have hoped for, this decision in substance. So that I think it has an impact on employees who really want to use the access request as a phishing opportunity. I'm fully with you. And I only hope that this judgment will make its way across Europe, because as you say, I mean, we are confronted with a lot of access requests from the UK, and indeed the ICO guidance and approach seems to be unfortunately completely different than what the German law here decided.
All right, excellent. One of the big parts of really complying with any privacy law, maybe starting with the GDPR, is leveraging the work that has been done with GDPR to handle other privacy laws, maybe such as the CCPA and all the other ones that have come since that time. What are some of the best ways to leverage the work that companies have done with GDPR and CCPA or GDPR data subject requests that they can use for the CCPA and other laws down the pipeline? Of the rights are not one-to-one matches, so there are differences, but what are some of the best ways that organizations can leverage their past data subject request work to handle future laws down the line?
Well, Ryan, as you mentioned, one of the ways, and this was earlier, talking about the processes that companies have put in place. So whether it's an intake process, a data inventory, which I haven't heard a single person ever say, I love doing data inventories. So whether it's those, whether it's the intake, whether it's checking the laws, whether it's the homegrown systems, verifying identity, all of those processes that you've put in place in order to enable yourself to respond to a data access request can be leveraged for additional laws. The CCPA, as you know, is the first in the US, and then you've got the CPRA coming right behind it, adding a few additional actions to it. The Virginia CDPA, as you said, is not quite exactly like the CCPA or the CPRA, but there's a lot of similarities there. I like the automated processing right under the Virginia CDPA. We will certainly have others come behind it. So how do you pull all this together? Well, one of the things, and something that we've been facing since GDPR was passed a little over 5 years ago now, is that you have the ability to decide how you want to implement your individual rights access or your individual rights program. And does it offer you enough of a financial leverage to differentiate your program? To have one set of rules that apply only where the rights are in place and another set of rules to apply elsewhere. In most companies, there's not enough return on investment to segregate your databases that way. So the biggest way you have to leverage is the fact that you're utilizing your technology or you're maintaining the integrity of your databases by not putting in different rules. That also helps with your employees. As you were asking earlier, how do you train your employees to make sure they know how to respond? Well, if they have 15 different rules they have to follow, that's not consistency. And consistency breeds compliance, and compliance breeds trust. So you have to be consistent, and that's probably the biggest way you can leverage, is to have one set of rules, unless it is truly an outlier to where you must have something different.
I think that's all right. And I would also add, if you think about what I would call I would call them the biggest pain points, but they're really some of the biggest complexities around doing this right. They do carry across every regulation and point of impact, meaning you cannot set up a data subject rights process without good data hygiene and good information management. And that doesn't matter what regulation you're talking about, right? That's always going to be the case to lay that foundation. And then some of the key pieces we've already spoken about, right? Having a good process to verify the identity of individuals to ensure you're not breeding risk when you attempt to provide these rights. That's obviously going to cut across. So with all those component parts, there's no waste, right? There's no place where it's not going to be applicable across. And so what I've always said, when talking about this is you kind of set up one overarching process, one foundational process, and then you can pull certain levers based on the regulatory scheme if you need to, but the major pillars are consistent across.
Yes, I completely agree with Laura. Clearly, the GDPR is the highest standard, clearly, and you can take this framework and your data subject request procedure that you have for Europe and use the same framework exactly for other countries. And if you go through the process, you are able to leverage and just to adapt, for example. And if I just take you can use the same metrics and you can even define the same delay if it's possible. For example, we have a general rule within the group. We try to respond in the delay required by the GDPR, even for the CCPA, and clearly it's a way to give a single rule to the customer services and to the people who have to manage this request, because we also need to try to bring a bit more simplicity, because it's complex procedure. So if you had different rules for different region, clearly you could put the process at risk. So we choose to reduce the delay, but to try to simplify it for different regions.
Yeah, I also agree to that. That is what we how we approached it as well. And I mean, the in-house homemade system allowed us to have the 30 days period as a default, but we can manually change the deadline. But Aurélie, as you said, we also have taken the same approach to get with the strictest and apply it everywhere. And as of now, I think the strictest still seem to be the GDPR. So same.
Excellent. Great. Just to let everyone know, we're at the halfway point of the session. So if you have any questions, we have a few that have come in so far. Feel free to send them in. We'll probably tackle them in about 15 minutes or so. As we've mentioned a couple times, the talk about training, I'd like to revisit it a little bit, particularly who should organizations be training to handle these data subject requests? Kay, I think maybe talk about the training privacy professionals to use privacy technology to take on these data subject requests. Who should be handling them? How should they be trained? I think more on that would be pretty great.
Well, before I get into who and how, let me share with you one of the analyses under the CCPA. When the regulations were passed, the agencies have to do that cost analysis that's required to do. And they actually said there was zero cost for training, because the only people that needed to know how to respond to individual rights or anything around it were your privacy professionals, and your privacy professionals already knew how to do so. So there was absolutely no training cost associated. That is probably my biggest pet peeve ever with any of the cost analysis for law, because as we all know, and Aurélie, you mentioned it earlier, these requests can come in from anywhere. They can come to your customer service lines, your chats, your email, the dedicated processes that you put in place, whether it's a form online or it's a privacy email, and anyone who can receive those requests needs to be trained how to handle them, because they may not absolutely recognize them as a request. So your frontline customer service person that's dealing with someone trying to, I don't know, collect a late fee on a bill or something might not recognize a request as an individual rights request. And so everyone has to be trained how to recognize them, where to send them, and absolutely how important it is to manage them, because as we said, the time frames around them can vary greatly. And you might need to respond to them within 24 to 72 hours, at least for that first response, to let them know that you received it. And so the training needs to be heavy. It needs to be often, and it needs to be repeated in about 100 different ways in order for it to actually click, as well as the fact that you're constantly going to have an influx of new employees in and out of especially those high demand areas that might be the ones getting most of the requests. One of the others that I say you have to make sure you train are your salespeople, because they are focused on doing sales. They are not generally focused on customer service in any other perspective. And so they in particular having such a drive and a perspective, but yet they might be the ones that receive those requests, because they're the ones in contact with the end customers, especially if you're a B2B. And yes, B2B sometimes, many times, depending on the law, might actually have requests as well. And people like to say that under the CCPA or the CPRA, B2B do not have requests or do not have rights, or employees do not have rights. And that's not necessarily true. Right now it's under a moratorium, but there are other laws out there that might apply. So even under the CCPA, B2B still have rights when it comes to the ability to opt out of sales. And employees or applicants still have rights when it comes to doing a privacy notice and knowing where their data is being shared. So it's really hard to stay on top of all this as a privacy professional, much less as someone else in the company whose privacy is not their job.
I couldn't agree more to that. I really couldn't agree more.
And
California thinks you don't need to learn anything. You should already know it.
And you need to train your people to react to the request of the data subject. So we try to identify specific verbatim of the client to be able to share him with our customer services, because sometimes the client is not going to say or to write, I would like to exercise my data subject right under the GDPR. So clearly you need to be able to identify the verbatim of the client to be able to respond properly. It's very important. It's very important also to avoid to miss some requests, to be able to limit the risk of complaint to the DPA, because generally if you miss one data subject request, you could have a complaint afterward, and this is what you would like to avoid.
Excellent. Sharon, I have a question for you specifically, since you mentioned you have an in-house solution for handling data subject requests. Have you found that having your own own technology in-house has made it easier to onboard people as they handle these data subject requests?
No, not necessarily. And that is still the test. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, wonderful. No, but I couldn't echo more what was previously said. The thing is that, or the point is that we don't want to have each and everybody responding to our customers and to individuals with privacy legalese responses, right? So what we want our workforce to do is identify, as Kay said, identify the request, because it's not always that someone says, hey, by the way, I made a GDPR related request or CCPA related request, but we need to get that into the privacy team. And so that is kind of independent from the home own made system, because it's the same bunch of people who will handle, at least within UPS, who will handle the individual requests. But these requests can be submitted to each and everybody who is kind of customer facing, and that can even be our drivers. But we don't want to have our drivers who deliver a package to you to get involved in a legal subject access request related discussion. So what we need to do is, and that is again just echoing what was said, train the people to give the right answer and to channel all of the individuals to the right point within UPS.
Awesome. Another point that Kay brought up that I wanted to discuss is the matter of cost. A couple of months ago, I profiled for our IAPP Daily Dashboard newsletter a tool that came out from Transcend that calculated the costs of and return on investment for returning data subject requests from a staff standpoint, a technology standpoint, the whole kit and caboodle. I'll ask the panel, what are some ways that organizations can help manage their costs as they handle these requests, particularly if they have a very high volume of them?
I'll jump in then. So since we're tech, so one of the things I think, especially if they're high volume, one of the best saves that I've seen for companies is now that you know that there are individual rights. And yes, we all know Directive 95 was there first, but most people, especially in the US, were ignoring that. So one of the best ways that you have on the technology is now that you know, you can build your technology with that in mind. So one of the issues about deleting data is that you might actually break a database. But now that you know you might have to delete data, if you can build it in a way to where deleting a part doesn't break it, you at least have that cost advantage. And so that's probably one of the best advantages I've seen in the technology, and how to leverage that is just simply knowing, and knowing is half the battle, but making sure that your IT, your engineers, your technology, whatever department it sits under, understands what it is that you're trying to do. And I still find that there are complications in many companies in understanding, one, what is personal data or personal information, as Arlie said earlier, what is data versus documents. So you've got the structured versus unstructured data as well, but then you've also got the whole what's a cross-border flow of data. What does access mean? And so when you're missing some of these basic concepts of privacy, that absolutely trickles into your costs and your expenses going forward.
Yeah,
Yeah,
I would agree with that. I think, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Just quickly, I think for us, it's we have the issue with cost when it comes to employee requests, because usually for our customers, we do not have more than the package level detail, right? What you need for delivering and picking up a package. But for employees, that is when it becomes really tricky. And I mean, in the best scenario, as previously mentioned, you try to align with your former employee or employee and try to figure out what is in their interest. And let's be honest, very often it's for the preparation of agreements, and they sometimes they do allow you for narrowing down the scope. If that is not the case, really you need to be very reasonable on how you shrink down the request, and we are pretty hesitant to doing so. So for us, it's really a cost impact definitely given.
Right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I would know it, especially in the employee space, but really across the board. Sometimes it's a matter of understanding what the individual actually is seeking, right? And so that can come into play too. I mean, it's possible that from a customer perspective, they just want to opt out of marketing emails, but they see, you know, a button on your site that says delete my data or something to that effect. They go that route when that's not what's intended, and clearly that's a much more expensive endeavor for a company. But from the employee perspective as well, especially when you start to talk about emails and the need to redact information that might not relate to that individual in particular in an email chain, that becomes very cost intensive. And so if you can work with that employee or that individual to understand truly what they want within their rights, then you can also look to whittle down that cost.
And I thought it was really interesting under California guidance and the regs that came out around almost, not quite, but almost that exact topic of when someone does want you to delete their data and they press, you know, the big red button, you're not supposed to now come back to them with letting them know what are the repercussions to deleting your data. You have to scroll 5 times to understand, well, it might do this, it might do that, or they might have to click through certain screens. And now that's made companies a little leery in clarifying what it is individuals want. And that shouldn't be the case. Individuals rarely understand the full repercussions of deleting all their data. What do you mean all my reward points are gone? Anything along that line. And so now you're kind of caught between regulators wanting to be very consumer friendly and stopping all the sometimes roadblocks put in the way, and then truly wanting to be able to give the employees or the individuals what it is they're looking for, because you either have to deny it all or grant it all if you can't clarify. And that's not usually the best way for anyone.
Awesome. All right. So we have about 15 minutes left in the session. We got plenty of questions to get to. So we'll try to knock off as many as we can before the end of our time here. First one, when handling an erasure data subject request, how do we ensure the accuracy of such erasure? Has there ever been a service disruption from an application because the erasure request was too complicated? How do we best handle this situation? We'll open up to anyone in the panel.
Yeah, Brian, you asked a question before about data mapping. I mean, it's such an important foundation, and good data management practices are such an important foundation, because you do need to understand your system integrations, and you need to understand when you're honoring an erasure request. If you don't understand your systems, if you don't have your mapping, you're going to have collateral damage, right? And nobody wants to see that. So I think really it's the front end exercise of understanding what your systems look like, understanding your system integration before you start, before you build your process.
I agree. And the first time you break it is when they will learn that they really do want to do the data inventory.
And also understanding dependencies. Because if you have dependencies between different systems, you are not able to, for example, to erase the data from an end-to-end system. So you really need to understand the dependency between the system and why you are going to. You need to keep some data for some duration, for example.
Yeah, exactly, Aurelie. I think that's also a point I would like to mention, that making the people aware of that the right for erasure or deletion is not an absolute one. Right. So you honor it to a certain extent that you can, but some other obligations might prohibit you from deleting data just as such, or just if a request comes in. And then I think it's excuse me. It's key to inform the person in an appropriate and comprehensive way of why you cannot delete all of the data that you might hold.
Yes, and I don't know if in your case, but in my case, data deletion is the most exercised right. So I have a lot. I think that more than 50% of my data subject requests are data deletion, and And probably about 80% of these requests have to be rejected because I am not able to delete all the data of the client. But it's very difficult to explain in clearly or simply that you are able to delete the data for, I don't know, marketing, and that you have to keep some data from legal purposes, or to be able just to be compliant with your legal obligation. The balance, it's clearly not, it's clearly really difficult for the data controller.
Yeah.
I think this is another area where, and I know I keep mentioning this, but it cannot be privacy acting in a silo, right? Because the right to erasure is not, it's not just really in effect, it's not just about data subject rights, because obviously you have disposition requirements for your records as well. And so to the extent you have records management, people really looking at records management within your organization, or other attorneys involved, to your point, because you have to understand where you might have conflicting legal requirements to retain the data. So it can't be privacy acting in a silo, and you need to look to other stakeholders and look at existing processes when you build this out.
We have another question about a particular type of request. What are some of the best practices when handling the withdrawal of consent, and also its impact on the subsequent exploitation of shared data?
The subsequent exploitation of shared data. I love whoever submitted that request. Thank you. The subsequent exploitation. I'm going to remember that phrase. I'm actually going to write it down. But yeah, so repeat the question for me again, because I really focused on that one phrase.
It is a good phrase. You can't deny that. What are the best practices of handling the withdrawal of consent?
So one of the big things, and I can't say this is a best practice so much as this is an absolute mandatory action, is to make the withdrawal of consent as easy as the giving of consent was done. So of course there are certain circumstances where withdrawal of consent just simply is ineffective. For example, if someone gave consent to use their photo for online advertising, yes, you can withdraw their consent from using the photo going forward, but you're not ever going to be able to remove their photo from what you've already used it for, especially if it was print material and sent out. So I would say there's two things. One, make it very easy. People should be able to withdraw consent. Make sure that consent was done properly in the first place, and they understand that withdrawing consent, what the repercussions of that can be. And I do mean repercussions. And then third is simply the fact for them to understand where exactly it can play into. And so understanding where that consent is and what it plays into and what repercussions, and make it easy on them. Those are your best practices. including the subsequent exploitation of shared data. I love that.
If anything, everybody can take away that one phrase if you've learned
Yeah.
anything tonight. Another question, we're going back to the the land of privacy laws. When there's a variation in data privacy rules pertaining to data subject rights in various countries, which rule takes precedent, especially involving multinational corporations during litigation?
Fabulous question. Anyone? Okay, I'll talk until someone else says, okay, I will. So it's interesting to say which one takes precedent. So I would say the default, and this doesn't apply in 100% of the case, is the country where the person's from. So usually their laws are going to be most protective over their data. So if they have that right, then it's going to be their country. If it's not their country, then it should be whatever the most protective laws are that apply to them. I mean, that's what you absolutely have to do, is whatever they're allowed to take advantage of, you have to use for them. And that might be the most conservative, and it might be something you don't want to, but if it applies to them, then that's the one you need to follow.
Yeah, I echo that. And especially if you are in a litigation case, I think you just need to see what law is applicable. I think it's not, I mean, the question sounds a bit like you have the choice, which is just not the case. You need to, we might all wish for that, but I think it's not the case. So, but I mean, to the point that I think it was also Aurélie who made that point previously. If you as a general rule go with the strictest, and as you say, Kate, with the most protective one, I think you are already in a good position. However, and I'm stumbling a bit over this litigation because especially and in particular in litigation, you really need to think of what is favorable, what is an absolutely must, where do you have leeway to leverage, and in litigation you have some other rules which really might also come into play, and that is what you really need to take into balance here.
Yes, I agree with you, and in particular because sometimes you don't know what is the nationality of the client. So
right.
Clearly, you should be able, you could be able to respond to a data subject request without knowing what is the nationality of the client. So without knowing what is the applicable law under its nationality. So sometimes when you are cross country and when you know you need to manage this kind of issue, I think you need to you could also choose to apply the law applicable to the data controller. And if you took the highest standard, basically it should be the same result. So
yeah,
if you don't have the nationality of the client, you could choose to apply the law of the data controller.
And Laura, I think you were talking earlier about trying to make sure that the laws of the different areas that you might be subject to that you follow, and what the complications might be of trying to determine if the data subject is in a locale that might have a law different from what you have.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. And again, this is where currently, to the extent you need more nuance without ever trying to dissuade the individual from exercising their rights, you could ask certain questions, right? And there's an art and not a science here, right? Because as you said, hey, you know, under CCPA, for example, the regulator actually kind of said that you should not have that back and forth. So again, art and not a science. And there's a little bit of risk associated with this, but to try to hone in on that, you know, the domicile, for example, is something that you could do.
Yeah.
All right. We're going to go touch back on another topic we discussed this morning, which is verification. Is it enough to delete the data used for verifying the idea of the person making the request, or does one need to record the receiving and deletion of the verification data?
Clearly, when I mentioned the decision of the CNIL, I was very uncomfortable with this decision because it means that you were able to keep the ID of the client just for the time necessary to check the identity of the client, and you were not able to keep the national ID within your document to be able to demonstrate that you did the checking. Because from my point of view, I am going to keep every information related to the data subject request. So clearly it means the initial request of the client, email exchange, the information that we provide to him if it's a right of access, for example, to be able to demonstrate to the DPA in case of control or litigation that we have properly handled the case. So if I have to delete the ID after checking it, it means that I am going to lose part of my accountability pieces. And clearly, it's very tricky, I think, because it could also be a data breaches. So if you send the data to a third party, and if you do not identify properly the client, you are in breach related to the GDPR. So it's very difficult to be balanced and to be able to protect yourself as a data controller properly, but also to allow the client effectively to keep to minimize the personal data regarding to this processing activity.
Agreed. And I will say one of the other complicating factors is deletion. So it's very difficult to delete data out of backups. And I know that, you know, privacy professionals educate each other. Yes, make sure they delete your data from the backups too. Well, that's very difficult to do. And especially when it comes to individual data. So you have to keep a record, because if you ever do restore from backup, you need to be able to go through and delete that data before you restore it, unless you were actually able to go delete it from backups, which isn't easy to do. So it's making a fine balance between them, and part of that call might be as to where you only get a few or a few data subject requests, or do you get thousands a month or tens of thousands a month. So I guess it also depends on your volume and the level of work you're able to do to it, because one of the questions you asked earlier is how much work is there to actually comply with requests? Well, it depends on your volume.
I agree. And I also share the concerns of Lee. However, I think the German Data Protection Authority follows the CNIL approach and view. And our way of handling that issue is that we define a playbook, which we train our people on, the people who work in the privacy office, and then really delete the data that we have received for verification identification purposes. But we also had lengthy discussions on whether we want to take that risk, because in the end, if someone challenges us, we might be in a weaker position for evidencing that we have checked the validation or did the validation check. So yes, it is a tricky issue that you are in.
And how shocking that the German data protection authorities agreed with the CNIL.
Just one thing to note here, and I agree with what everyone has said, and I think the question has been fully answered, so not in direct response to the question, but we haven't really talked a lot about the need to have an audit trail for these requests, which is coming out here in the response to this question. And so I just wouldn't want to miss the moment to call out, you know, one of the practices that you need to implement is ensuring that you have that audit trail of how you've responded to these.
All right, well, this is great. Thank you very much. We're almost out of time. We have we have about 2 minutes left. Before we wrap up, does anyone on the panel have any final thoughts on data subject requests? Anything that we've touched upon? Final thoughts as we kind of move forward with more privacy laws coming down the pipeline, more citizens gaining these rights as these laws are come into effect. Are there any final thoughts before we wrap up today?
Yeah, I would just note that we've talked a lot about cost and complexity, and those are certainly factors that we can't ignore, and they make this all very, very challenging. But I forgot who said it earlier, but the other important to note is not just that this is for your customers and for individuals, but it is a way to differentiate yourself, right? And so when internally you're talking to your stakeholders, to your leadership, to management about the need to do this, the need to do it right, and the cost associated with it, you know, people shouldn't miss the moment to say, also this is a good way, right? We should think about this in a good way as a marketable way to differentiate ourselves and to really, continue to maintain the trust of our customers.
I'll just add that it's going to get worse before it gets better. So if you don't have a process to deal with individual requests now, you need to do one. Start with the data inventory, please. Please get it right.
I'm just going to add that clearly I saw the consequences of data subject request who goes wrong clearly, and it's better to take some time to respond properly, because after that, if you don't do it, clearly it means that you could be in a litigation, and clearly you are going to lose a lot of time, and it would be more costly than simply taking some time to respond properly to a data subject request.
Yeah, and I think we all are prepared for handling data access requests or individual right requests, which have privacy at its core, right? But if they are abused, I think we all wish for some appropriate guidance from the regulators and maybe also from the EDPB.
Yeah.
All right, great. We are right at time. I'd like to thank our panel for meeting up and discussing this very important topic today. I think we covered a lot of ground, and I will turn the floor over to Rajesh.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much to all our esteemed panel speakers, Lara Weiss, Shirin Huber, Kay, Royal, Aurel, and again to the moderator, Ryan. It's a wonderful session, some quite interesting points, something much more deliberating. I think this is not going to be an end. There's going to be a lot of complexity that is we could still expect in this particular, and I think the authorities or the communities needs to come up with appropriate code of conduct or a kind of guidelines that could really much make it easier for organizations to comply. And some of the recap of some of the points is about the user friendliness of the process, just also for the users or the data subjects who are raising the request, at the same time for the organizations to ensure the compliance status. Yes, the Oxford example was quite interesting. I would really like to pick that details and probably use it for much more larger research. And I think this is going to be a case in most scenarios, and I'm sure verifying an individual identity of a person even prior exposing the data is going to also put much risk. And I think the organization's approach should be more from a risk-based perspective than in line with the legal and regulatory requirements. And subsequent exploitation, yeah, what a term. I think that's something which is very impressive. And last but not the least, the cost and the complexity along with doing the thing right. I think the biggest issue when we see from a data subject right standpoint is using of unstructured data. I mean, specifically where you have systems in place, but instead communications made through electronic email. I think that's the biggest challenge for organizations, and maintaining the log trail and trying to involve in implementing a discovery process at the time of a data subject rights is really alarming for the organizations to comply. And this is a kind of a tipping point which I would like to say. Again, thanks. Now to our next session, and this session the topic is on standards and privacy management and assurance to demonstrate accountability. So for any organization to succeed in a kind of a privacy program, they constantly look to apply for some kind of an internationally accepted framework. This framework helps the regulators and authorities to manage their enforcements. At the same time, it also assesses the requirements laid under the law for organizations to provide a kind of assurance in implementing these requirements at an operational end within the context of data processing. Post GDPR plus, we have been hearing a lot of privacy frameworks. The one prior to GDPR, we had the OECD, we had the generally accepted privacy principles. We also had the APEC guidelines. And post GDPR, we had NIST framework. We also have ISO standards 27701 and much more to come. And as new standards and frameworks are emerging with a privacy and personal info management focus, organizations are increasingly assessing their applicability to the needs to kind of have a demonstrable indicator, for privacy compliance. So under that, would like to call upon Professor Dr. Kai Rannenberg, Chair of Mobile Business and Multilateral Security at University, and who is also the co-winner of ISO SE 27 Working Group 5, Identity Management and Privacy Technologies, who will be the speaker of this session. To introduce much more about Kai, he has been with the university since 2002, before which he was with the System Security Group at Microsoft Research Cambridge, focusing on some of the key research works on personal security devices and privacy technologies. Kai has also been active in international ISO IEC standardizations of IT security and criteria of security evaluation primarily. Kai is also an active in the Council of European Professional Informatics Societies, chairing its legal and security issues special interest network since 2003. From 2004 until 2013, Kai served as an academic expert in the management board of the European Network and Information Security Agency, which we call it as NIST. So over to Kai.
Okay, thanks a lot, Rajesh. And can people hear me, and can you possibly also see me on the camera? Okay, perfect. Thanks a lot. So this is Kai Rannenberg speaking. What I was just saying, have people heard that already, or should I repeat it? So, well, maybe I assume that you hadn't heard anything before, so I'm going to live now. Hello, welcome. My name is Kai Rannenberg. I'm a professor for mobile business and multilateral security. You've heard about that already. And thanks you very much for this very kind invitation and very nice introduction into this presentation. And I hope you can enjoy that, and it makes sense for you to have this. I have tried to structure the following minutes in the following fashion. I'm going to talk a little bit about standardization, because I suppose most of you are experts in privacy, but maybe not everybody in standardization. So I thought I'm going to try to address a few myths that sometimes people have with regard to standardization. And I'll talk a little bit of standardization organizations. Then I'm going to go on privacy and standardization with a specific example that is a working group 5 with an ST27 that I'm convening. And so I know a bit about it over the years, and I know some of you are also volunteering in that group, but probably not everybody. I will show a bit of the projects and how they came into life, and also try to put that into relation onto the GDPR, because we had the title that was accountability and assurance, and I thought GDPR is maybe a good example to show how certain standards can be used for that. Even though, of course, I can tell you I don't have the one global framework that already was asked for in the last sessions. If we have time, we go through a few example projects, and then, of course, we can have and we'll maybe talk about how the further work environment is, some liaisons with the Global Privacy Assembly, for example, and some experiences and outlooks on all of this, depending how much time we will have in the end. I understand. Try to have a look at the chat if there are exciting questions, and I try to deal with them then if that is working. So let's start with some standardization myths. and that somebody have. So standardization myth number one usually is standardization is always leading to a single solution. So standard means exactly one thing, one size fits all. That may be true sometimes, and one motivation to get standardization up, of course, was the issue with electrical voltage. And 220 volt or 110 volts for some parts of the world for general electric goods. But again, there can be other voltages for other purposes. There can also be paper punching. There are quite a few scenarios where you basically have reference models. And paper sizes are an example. You don't have a single paper size in ISO. You have A4, you have A3, you have B4, B3, whatever you need. But you have a kind of framework where things are coordinated to each other. Open communication is another example where you have reference models. Basically, part of the internet wouldn't exist. And then we hope that with privacy, we can also achieve similar ways. And again, there are options to choose from, but at least complexity is somehow reduced. Myth number two is standards are always mandatory prescriptions. And the most important point here, of course, and again, I'm talking and saying that also because I know some of you are lawyers and regulators, and usually whether something is mandatory in a standard or whether a standard is mandatory, I should say like this, whether a standard is mandatory or not, that depends on the reference and not on the standard itself. The standard may have something mandatory in itself, but whether it is mandatory to use a standard is coming from the reference document. There is a typical example from Germany that are used from traffic law and traffic safety. There is a standard that describes your first aid pack, and whenever there is an update for the first aid pack in the car, it may be easier if standardization organization experts say we want to have the new thing for COVID or whatever into the first aid material in the car than to have a new law for all of that. And of course, there can be also references in the contract between supplier or customer or any other kind of business or business consumer relation. And insurance companies also, of course, they sometimes refer to standards. And you can have standards in the guidance document, for example, as best practice. And that is probably coming closer to what we are seeing in some scenarios sometimes now when we are in very often new field. That can be useful because then you don't need to have to explain and justify your approach. And maybe even it's useful to reduce liability risk. Probably there is this nobody got ever fired for buying IBM effect. That can be good or not good. Again, it can give you some assurance. Of course, it can also stop in progress. But again, if you maintain the standards properly, there is a way to deal with that. And again, you can have it standard as one option or as some of several options. Meanwhile, the European Union is taking a more aggressive stance on standards, for example, like some other governance and areas, and that may lead to some more mandatory references, especially in the security field. Some of them will probably also have an effect on privacy then. What kind of standardization exists? In principle, let's see, there is the nation-state oriented privacy that we're going to talk about quite a bit, the global one by ISO, IEC, and the Joint Technical Committee #1 from ISO and IEC, and the one that was set up because ISO and IEC couldn't really agree otherwise who is going to take on an computerized and information processing standardization. There's a number of other ones. Of course, we should mention BIS, which is a very active member in the ISO IEC arena. For example, also in my working group, I have very active and volunteers from India like Srinivas, and I think who's going to report in the next talk, and maybe he's also going to tell about his standardization and experience, so I need to be careful. Anyway, we have an industry consortia, organizations of professionals, government bodies that are doing standards. Again, I'm going to focus on privacy and especially on one group with regard to this, simply to reduce complexity. So the groups that I'm going to focus on is a committee called SE27 that used to be actually IT security, but meanwhile, after some years of privacy standardization happening, and we made it into the headline. Actually, I'm just noticing that somehow in the screen you don't see the upper part of my screen for whatever reason. This is funny, but anyway, you would see the name. You would see the full name there, which is security, cybersecurity, and privacy, and privacy protection within this JTC1 computer and information processing technologies thing. And SC27 is sitting somewhere between SC2 for coded character sets, that was there from the beginning, and younger committees like, for example, SC42 for artificial intelligence. So let's hopefully that our headlines will not kill us too much here. So this is SC27 facts and figures. If you wonder who's participating in SC27, about 80 countries, 47 are really voting and active, and 33 are observing, and 292 standard projects. Not all of them in my working group for privacy, but you will see quite a few of them. Again, if you're interested, I think we will make these slides available some way or the other. And but there is also some download sources here where you can, if you like to look at some overview documents, they will come here. We will also come up with some additional ones. There are 5 working groups, and you may have seen some of the other working groups already elsewhere. We're going to see them also in the next picture. There's a working group 1 on information security management standards, ISMN. ISMS, that is the one that has generated ISO, IEC, ESIT in 27000, and the whole family with 27001, 02, and so on. Management systems, we're going to put a relation to that standard. And also, but in principle, ISMS are doing assessment and guidelines for process and environment scenarios. That's basically what we can mainly see there. You have a technical group on cryptography. You have a group on security controls and services, very often related to the working group 1 stuff, and you have a working group 3 on security evaluation. And you see that looking for several areas. Working group 5, the one on identity management and privacy technologies, that is actually doing the whole thing: assessment, guidelines, techniques, and product, system, process, and environments. The whole area is covered. And you may wonder, why did we start standardization for privacy in the security group? And I can tell you there were some challenges and some advantages. I'm starting with the challenges here. A legacy information security and management paradigm that you've seen from your security colleagues, or maybe you're working in security also, is collect as much information as possible. Maybe you can make use of it. Obviously, when you're doing privacy and talk about data minimization, there is a bit of a character and a bit of a culture and cultural dissonance here, and you have to deal with that and work about that. And we had to do that because we know it's actually not even in modern security best practice to collect everything, but certainly not in privacy. So that was something we needed to explain to the security colleagues, that this was an issue. And it worked out in the end, you see, meanwhile, people understanding things better. Another thing, and that is coming from a picture from Germany. Rajesh, is there anything that I'm doing wrong? Is maybe for those of you who read German, you may like that picture where next time the COVID allows you to travel to Berlin, you may enjoy and go to the York bridges. Otherwise, the main thing with security and privacy is both of them address systems and their design in a holistic way. And I have an English translation for what we have here, which I think is relevant and important. And we don't want a piece of the cake. We want the whole bakery, because we do not only need to look after how systems look and how processes are done, we also look in the way how the process is being set up and how things are being done. And that is, I think, a good thing to describe. Another reason why it was useful to work with the security committee was because there all the cryptographers are there, and of course cryptography can be a very useful tool for privacy. We had lots of technical experts who were coming to the meeting anyway, and they could help us. Meanwhile, you see the figures of about 700 committee members and 62 liaison representatives, and working group 5 from 45 national bodies. When we have a physical meeting, which unfortunately we did not have since October 2019, it's about 100 people. When you have a virtual meeting, it's 170. Of course, you never know how many of the 170 are really around, and we don't do any tough checks on this one. Don't worry about that slide. And I just put that in to give you some eye candy and for reading later. This is a list of standards that Working Group 5 now is looking after, but we have some other representation for this. And I'm just showing this because you want to compare it to what we had when we started back in 2008. And that was how we started. And of course, it's easier to explain, but of course, we have done more work now. So we're doing frameworks and architectures on identity management and on privacy. They still exist, and we come back to them later. We're doing reference models for privacy, and even access management, meanwhile, has been working. Again, that was 2008, and all of that was working. Meanwhile, these standards are completed. We do protection concepts, and you will see many more of those. And just we're doing standards and guidance and context on it and assessment. If you want to see it how it looks in a picture, maybe this is useful for you. Again, there's lots of numbers. Each number is a standard or standardization project. And what is useful on this picture is to take a look at the left side over here, because here you see a bit how things are structured and how things are layered. So let's start from the top, even though that is not our main activity area, but sometimes we're looking into standardization in application areas. Smart cities, fintech services. Smart cities has just been published. Fintech services has just been starting. So if you're interested in working on fintech services, you want to come and join the group. And Internet of Things and Big Data we are doing together with one of our sister groups, working group 4. Actually, Internet of Things is going on. Big Data has just been finished. Usually we're doing application area standardization only. And when we think we're going to learn something new on fundamental and principles for privacy, or when we have the feeling that nothing is happening in the application area and maybe we can help and trigger something. That are the situations when we do privacy application standardization. Usually what we did, we started from a general framework in privacy, that is 29100, a privacy framework. I come back to it later. And roughly spoken, it is translating major regulatory principles in a way that we hope that technology people can understand them. So you find the GDPR principles, the OECD principles, all of that. That standard is actually freely available. A link will come later. And if you want to take a look, you can do that. We're also maintaining a privacy reference list to this and to have a more or less updated version of privacy and regulatory principles. Again, of course, the list is never fully complete and never fully up to date. But it's kind of useful to at least put some reference into it. And again, of course, we're happy if people come and support the work there. This is a framework. Then we put in management. And I think probably the most famous management standard that we're having at the moment is 27701. That is the extension of the security management standard 27000 for privacy management that people are using. And that is basically trying to expand the idea of security management standardization and even certification into privacy. And for some parts, that is working. Meanwhile, we have even requirements for certification published, 27006 Part 2. Some of you in ISS may know there was a 27006 for security. Now we have something for privacy. So a certification infrastructure is developing. Of course, all of that should also be fulfilled with some real content that is happening. So we have for quite some years now a privacy impact assessment standard that can be useful. You can work as, and it is risk-based, and you can also use it together with data flows. We have a new standard to support 27701 on an organizational privacy risk management. That one actually is in the works at the moment, advanced stage, but still people can work on it and can help with it. We have guidance on PII handling based on privacy preferences. That is important when you're dealing with customers and you want to give them some choices. So that is, let's say, top level of management. Then we have some more detailed levels on elements for management. Deletion, very often forgotten, not by you, but probably by some other colleagues. And we have now a standard that is close to completion on how to manage deletion concepts properly. And details on PII controls with 29151 also completed, and some specific things for cloud processors. And we also have in 27018. Actually, this one is also part of the official 27008 in family, so you may have seen it before. And you want to implement things, and that comes to something which you've probably seen as privacy engineering as a new term. And I think you're going to hear more about this in this conference about it, 27550, giving guidance for that. Actually, and I must apologize, there is a mistake here. This is in medal and method thing. It's not 27550, it's actually 27559. And when I give you the slides, I will correct that mistake here. So you have something on engineering methodology. You have something on privacy notices and consents that I'm going to maybe talk a bit later if we have time. So for implementing the interaction with your customer. And you have something on education and capability maturity model. I would have thought IAPP should be able to give some more input to work on this area, and that would be great. To have that from IAPP. If you look into more technology aspects, we have the architecture framework. There is a lot of stuff on privacy enhancing data de-identification now. Background, of course, is if you have something like this, maybe it helps to check whether data is really personally identifying or not, or at least to give an assessment how sensitive it possibly is. And for specific technology requirements, especially in identity management, we have something also. And what we have is something on standards privacy assessment. If you want to write a standard and educate people how to put privacy into it, which can also be used for systems in general, there is a few standards that can be here. If you are somebody who's really into 27701, this picture will be nice for you, because that is actually driving, looking at things from a 27701 perspective. You have and 27701 in the middle of it with best practices and some controls. You have the management system, and with some related standards there. You have the principles. You see this a kind of tree out of principles. The management system is coming. The ordinance certification is as a relation close to the root of the tree, and then you have for sector-specific sets of controls, and for specific controls you have related standards, you have application to specific areas, and guidance you also have. So this is also the way how you can see how we're doing our work. If you're interested in that data management, and that has a lot to do with privacy, I can advertise our terminology and concept general framework. In principle, we have a very similar picture here, just it's not as full because the standards are this general standard architecture is not developing as rapidly and as volatility, so we have some clearer scenarios here, but we have this general framework for identity management that can be of useful. Why is this important, or why can this help you possibly with assurance? And as we think, this is a list of articles of the GDPR, and of course you can do a similar exercise with other regulation that is maybe relevant for you, but GDPR obviously is a useful example, and you see some of the articles that are asking for some kind of implementation and underpinning, from definition of data and over processor descriptions, privacy protection certificate up to certification. And so I made a list and see what kind of standards could we possibly have that can support. Again, Okay, hello, welcome back. Somehow the connection broke. I don't know what happened, but I hope you may remember this slide 27, where we try to put in relation the standards of Working Group 5 to articles of the GDPR, articles that are relevant when you try to be compliant and against which you may be held accountable. And so what you have here is an overview, and again, you don't need to understand all of the details now, but I thought it's maybe a useful overview. You find articles which have requirements and which may need some underpinning, and you find related standards that are existing and may be useful. So if it comes to definition of personal data and especially pseudonymization, there was an effort to, in 2889 on privacy enhancing data de-identification. And it's not the rule that say, hey, this is personal data and not. It wasn't that easy, but at least it delivers some terminology and classification of techniques. It was driven from a Canadian editor, but it got quite some global consensus in the way as it is. And we're trying to do more in this area. When you see something blue here, it's a completed project at the moment. When you see it in red, it is work in progress. And you see now quite a bit of blue, so there are some related standards. When it comes to the processor, you find 27018 that can be useful. And when it comes to certification, of course, you find 27001 and 27006 as an accreditation thing. I'd like to advertise again 29134. I understand we lost a bit of time now due to the break, so I'm trying to move a bit forward. These are some new activities, but I think we can have them later. What I wanted to quickly show you is maybe a bit of the privacy framework. And that is basically just that you see these kind of principles you've seen before. I don't need to explain them to you as privacy professionals, but I suppose you have you can see what we're relating to. These are typical privacy principles and explained in technology. Something that may help you in implementation is dealing with the biggest lie on the internet. I think the biggest lie on the internet is this. And so especially when it's about reading and understanding terms and conditions. And so the idea of 29184 is to help people and to help you as designers of systems or controllers of systems and data to find a way how to talk to PII principles in the language that is appropriate at a place that fits and give notices and give choice and do all of the things that are needed. Again, that is, you can look at the slides later, but you see there is some help. Another thing that I'd like to show is we're talking about identity management. And Working Group 5, we claim to have the most privacy-friendly way of dealing with identity management. We don't have an approach from top. We have an approach where people are respected and you can have partial identities. So you can have, you do not need to give all of your identities. You also are not always identified. You can have partial identities to have something appropriate here. So, and then we have standards privacy assessment as an idea, basically an idea to say, hey, it is important to have privacy early in a standard and privacy considered early in a system. And this standing document number 4 can give you some help. And again, it's freely available. So just another quick thing on liaisons. We don't have a liaison with IAPP, which is maybe a shame, and we should have one. Maybe IAPP can be interested. And we are very proud that we have a liaison with a number of parties and research projects and big industry associations, professional organizations, the Global Privacy Assembly. Very early, very proud about that one, of course, you can imagine. Also with the EDPB and the Data Protection Board, and that helps us. So, what else I should tell you maybe is a few documents that are available and some experiences. So, in principle, this is still a learning experience, which makes it interesting and exciting. Lots of things are to do. It's a cultural learning experience to see how privacy is being dealt with in different countries and different parts of the world. You know that IAPP, global customers. Maybe I'd advertise meetings are usually happening every half year. At the moment, of course, mostly virtual. Last time we were in beautiful Paris. Maybe we'll be in nice Washington in the future, and maybe eventually we are in India again. We have once been in India, which in Jaipur, which was very nice. Maybe we come back to India also in future. Next time in October, there are meetings on all of these projects, and maybe you can be interested. If you want to read a bit more, this is material that you can find freely available. The links will be made available. Of course, my email address is also available for you take a look at. And with that, thank you very much for your attention and your interest, and also for your tolerance for the technical issues in between. I think we have saved a bit of time for questions. And if you have any kind of question, you're more than welcome to raise them, or if you have discussion points that you'd like to raise. I look forward to that. Okay. Hello.
Hello, hi Kai.
Hi Srinivas. How are you?
Srini, go ahead, Srini.
Yeah, I think we should finish question answers. Maybe then we have time towards the end. Yeah, Rajesh, have you sent the queue questions?
Hello.
Hello. Hi. So, Professor Kai, I would like to thank you for joining this. This is a privilege to have you here, and I want to tell the audience how important this topic was, because privacy standards we don't come to hear very often in most of the conferences, and we had you here, and you being the chair of WG5, working group 5 of ISO. There's no better person than you can give us this overview. And I think in 20 minutes, you covered most of the important aspects of the evolution of standards, the key standards that are required, and also brought in the future projects that are coming up. So one of the points I would like to ask while questions come, Kai, is the biggest question people have is that, ISO 27701, which is the standard which is followed by the as a PIMS standard by the industry, closest to fulfill the requirements of compliance, although no law has so far brought in as the acceptable standard. But the challenge that people face is that this standard requires you to have ISO 27001, and it is based on ISMS, and it's an extension of ISMS. So do you see this sometime in the future in the roadmap of ISO that this will become an independent standard like BS 10012 in UK, or do we continue with this kind of path? Because a lot of people feel that they have to go for 27001, only then they can adopt 27701. So what is your view on this?
This is a very interesting point, and you said a very important word, and the word was we. Because there is a history to this. Actually, there was a meeting in India when a lot of this was discussed after some deliberation before. Yep. And there was a discussion, should we have the privacy management independent from the security management so that we don't have extra work with the synchronization, or should we use it as a security management because it can be useful? And in those days, the decision was to say, let's try out what the security management colleagues have done and see whether that can work out. And now 27701 is a result of that strategy. Now that we have 27701, we have to see how it works. And that is important. Again, it's not me just making this decision. It is a standardization community, and of course, it's all of you who are working with this. If you have the feeling we should have an alternative or something better, then it's important that you come to Working Group 5 and to the standardization bodies and say, hey, we have the following issues. We need to make 27701 independent, or we need to change certain things, or we need to have something else. And then we can develop a standard and have a discussion there. It's not so much that I would like to make petition, because we are in early learning phase with this. We have set this up. I would say we should give it a fair chance. Everything that is new requires some effort. But if we have the feeling it doesn't work, maybe for some small application areas it is too heavy, then we should consider an alternatives and do other things. Again, it is the community in the standardization group that is making the decision. I'm not the boss. I'm just the convener. I'm trying to make sure that people can come to the front with their opinions and especially with their experiences also. And then we try to find the best solution that is appropriate in an area where we're all learning.
Right.
Even the professors.
Sure. That's good perspective brought in. The other question is, do you see the possibility of GDPR regulation or some equivalent regulations one day recognizing ISO 27701 and this set of standards to be acceptable or equivalent to being compliant to GDPR, somewhere near that?
Oh, that's a very difficult one. Somewhere near that, I think, is a possibility. But it will not be, well, I think in the first round, again, GDPR is also in its first years, and maybe some, for example, European member states who do that. It will not be an easy a simple thing like, hey, this is valid immediately, because when you're a data protection commissioner, you want to make sure that your citizens are well protected, and 27701 can be one option. And I think I think the point is now, if people are making really good data processing and data protection concepts based on 27701, this will be coming as one option, and then it may become best practice. I would not expect that somebody will say, hey, we make exactly 27701 the standard. Some data protection commissioners have their own models. Some of them I would hope we could integrate. Actually, very often they're very similar and practically speaking. And I would like to see more participation and integration there. And what I would expect is that if people who are using 27701, and that goes again back to you as professionals, of course, in practice, and or to us as we're trying to teach this, and is if we make really good solution based on 27701, then it can become best practice, and then it will be considered because it's best practice. But I would not expect something coming from above doing something for us. It is us ourselves who need to do it from ourselves and do the work and push it from the bottom by good work. That is my experience, at least.
That's right. I agree. And before we hand over to Rajesh and conclude, I would remind the participants, I think I also mentioned this, that the SC27 committee and Working Group 5 in specific, they are open to more and more people participating to develop standards in innovative technologies, etc. I myself am involved in several projects. And I think for this, you should contact your standards body in your country, through which you can, most of the countries will RNP member, America and Europe, etc. Through that, you can, through national body, you can actually then participate in contributing towards standards. Is that right, Kai?
That is correct. In case you're running into specific problems, please let us know. We're always trying to help in case there are whatever kind of problems that you would have. But in most cases, of course, indeed, you are nominated through your national body or to possibly a liaison organization. Again, if you're running into deep problems, let us know. We can try to find a solution. But for most countries, in most scenarios, and especially for India, for example, I think there is a way how this is all organized.
Sure. So thank you, Kai. Rajesh, anything else, or we conclude? No more questions, right? I think we're running out of time. Okay. So thank you, Kai. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you, Srinivas. Thanks for the invitation. Yes. And again, I'll send you the slides. I trust that you have a way to distribute them to the audience.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Dr. Kai, for this wonderful session, giving more insight about the nature and type of different works that are going on at the back end on terms of privacy and the relevant frameworks. Thanks, Srini, for pitching in and providing the essentiality of letting the audience know how important is this and how it applies for organization to meet certain organization objectives and comply with some of the regulatory requirements. Now to our next sessions, I would like, this is about a decade of being a CPO and key learnings. It's a personal experiences that has been led. Just to give a little bit context on the topic, it's more about customers and employees today are increasingly concerned about their privacy, and we do see a lot of questions that are emanating from recent conversations that have been hitting the public media. So how the personal information is controlled, is collected, who controls the data, and how it will be used. And this is a kind of a question that needs to be and more of an awareness from data subjects or individuals per se. And more the awareness increases, the more and more there is an obligation on the organizations to meet its expectations of the different stakeholders. So the role of a chief privacy officer, which is very central to an organization, needs to play a role which is advocate for both customers and employees and ensures that the company respects the privacy and is in compliance with regulations. At the same time, also use its other one to prevent any exposure to huge penalties under the privacy laws. This position ensures the integrity of an organization's data practices beyond privacy compliance, and where the CPO and its team works closely with other stakeholders, including the heads of businesses, the heads of compliance, security, the chief information officer, the chief data protection officer, the chief data ethics officer. I think the more and more the C-level suit is yet to be forming, depending on the growth the organizations are trying to achieve. But however, at the end of the day, this is more about an expansive approach that the CPO plays in order to ensure that the data privacy is embedded and incorporated as part of its ethics, as part of its governance, and as part of its data protection, and actively work with partners and regulators. So I would like to call upon Srinivas Pusrala, the Vice President and Global Chief Privacy Officer of Infosys Group, who will be the speaker of this session. Srinivas currently serves as for people who doesn't know Srinivas Pusrala currently serves as a Vice President and the Global Chief Privacy Officer, the subsidiaries, and where he has been for nearly 20 plus years. In addition to his vast experience at Infosys, he is also an active member of the committees, boards, and advisory groups working towards a common privacy and cybersecurity goals. He is also the co-author of the ISO 27701 standard, which Jessica was talking about in the previous session, which got published in October 2019, and also the Indian BIS standard 17428 on data privacy assurance, engineering, and management requirements. So over to you, Srinivas.
Hi. This is the closing session today. Welcome back again. This session is on my experience being a CPO for a decade. What are the key learnings? Before I start, I would just like to summarize the interesting aspects that we covered today. We started with a fireside chat with Deepak Padki and Trevor, which dwelled into various strategic items on data privacy related to the data guzzling industry. How do we balance between minimization principle and innovation. How do we look at privacy being free? What are the rights of people? Where is the where are the regulatory aspects lagging behind technology? Is it something to do with board need to pay attention on certain specific activities? Do they have to engage with stakeholders? All those aspects, and also interestingly, Trevor shared about his views on how should this data privacy authority structure should probably be instituted in India. Those are his perspectives. So those are all very useful for us. We then went into data subject rights. There was very interesting discussion on where to draw the line between various kinds of rights and what is the and what situations does an organization have the ability to refuse? What are the consequences of not answering on time? The nuances in the scenario of an employment. So all those aspects were covered. I think it took about 45 minutes. Very good, useful session we had. Very elaborate number of scenarios were covered. Then came Professor Kai's session, which just concluded. He spoke about the standardization, the importance of standardization. We started with the journey of standards and got into he covered the myths and came into security and then privacy specifically, because that's where the focus of this topic was. And he gave a bird's view on all the privacy standards that are currently going on. I think he covered very key standards, if I recall, and he also touched upon the future roadmap, which some of you can look forward to, and which you would be using, I'm sure, in the times to come. So that's a brief about it. I'm sure we will have lots of interesting sessions tomorrow and day after, and look forward to you coming back. Now I'll just come to the slides on the presentation about key learnings. So I have experience of 10 years. I'm 21-year-old in Infosys, and this role I've been taken for 10 years, and it was a very interesting journey. I don't even know how the time passed. It's so much of learning and so many challenges we faced. It's very difficult to put it in 20 minutes, but I will bring out only the key points. I just have one slide to cover, and I will be speaking the key bullet points, the salient points which I have. First, I would like to emphasize that when we read the applicable regulation, data privacy is driven by regulations, whether it is GDPR or any country. We have to understand why of the law and not just stop at what. Most of the regulations speak about what you need to do, and often we, as data privacy officers and CPOs, focus on looking at prescriptive guidance from the standards and feel that we need spoon feeding. We like to tell me what you need to do, and then we'll do it. We go with the checklist approach. We want to buy tools and quickly fix issues and move forward. We are not interested in understanding. So it's very important to understand why of the law. Only then you will be able to appreciate, and when you do privacy impact assessments, deploy the right kinds of solutions. It is why which will tell you why is it that sometimes personal information behaves as sensitive personal information. Why is it that Article 14 requires you to inform data subjects when you collect data not from the data subject? Why is it a legitimate business interest can be challenged? Why is it that what is the concept of this fairness mean? Why there are so many connotations about fairness? Why is it that a consent has to be revocable? It has to be fair. What is the reason that principles, rights, and international data transfers require 4% GDPR penalty, vis-a-vis all other aspects require only 2% penalty? What is the rationale for all this? So if you appreciate that, keep these in mind, then you'll be able to implement things much better on the ground, and you'll know where to take risks, which is the possible solution, because it increasingly is expected to document the privacy impact assessments, and when you do that, you need to you're required to specifically analyze and document why did you use this approach and why not plan B, and when you used plan A, were there any less privacy intrusive ways you could have achieved the same, and why did you adopt this? So all those aspects will be able to decipher only when you understand the concept of why. The next important point is about privacy versus security. There is a lot of confusion even now in the people's mind, rightly so, because security came much before. Almost 2 decades ago, security became very important for the industry. Privacy issues became emerged in the last 1 decade, I would say, and today they are at equal pedestal. And see that the reason it also happened was because the term data protection is used often instead of privacy, and that has to do with it has its own legacy. But data protection, although and privacy are interchangeably used, often data protection is also used to refer to security. And people think that, okay, it's when you say privacy and data protection, it's same as security. But in reality, security, we know, is just one of the principles of privacy, and very, very important principle of privacy. It is not to be undermined. Security is extremely important, but the requirements of privacy and security are different. They have an intersection if you try to attempt to put a Venn diagram, but often there is a zone of conflict, which is important to realize, because when you when you use, let's say, Article 32 of GDPR, etc., to deploy security measures, you often end up implementing detective controls in security, because while preventive controls are there, increasingly detection controls are more helpful in security, and these detection controls become intrusive often in a workplace and in many other scenarios, or it collects much more information. It uses AI, ML, and in those scenarios, it is required to balance between to what extent you can intrude into privacy of people when you detect frauds or detect malware software, etc., vis-a-vis the privacy aspects of people. Is consent required? Will consent help? No, often consent will not help, because in a environment where you require security, consent is of no use, because you don't want anybody to escape using consent as an excuse to bypass controls. So this poses a challenge, and that's one of the reasons I would always urge that security and privacy needs to be different in the organization structure. They have a zone of commonality, and they have to coordinate very well between the two, but they need to be independent. You need to demonstrate accountability. We all know accountability is a very important principle of GDPR, as well as referred in various aspects of the law, because this is the key basis of doing the data protection assessments. When you do an assessment of a particular app or a particular tool or a particular setup or entity, whatever, the first thing you need to base is on what is the existing current records of processing, current processing inventory of various processes, what information you collect, what is the purpose of collection, who all are the people who access it, where is the cloud storage location located, do we have any sensitive data, are there any disclosures, do you use third party? All these questions are extremely important for you to take a decision when you analyze and put the right controls. And in doing so, it is important to design the controls in such a way that the system encourages you to keep logs of everything, whether it is some change request, whether it is an access request of data. All these aspects have to be kept for various reasons. One, to demonstrate accountability to the authorities, and two, to be able to cater to the data subject request in the event somebody questions you that where is my data, what data you have, who all accessed my data. So ROP is extremely important, and this is not a one-time exercise. ROP is an ongoing exercise. Every now and then, it's a reality that technology and process keeps changing, the regulations keep changing. We reassess our impact on the privacy, and when we do that, it is important to keep log of that, and the concerned stakeholders within the organization who actually make these changes need to commit to the data protection officer that there is no change this quarter, and if there's a change, then this is what the change is. Because if your entire report of recommendations of data privacy controls are based on a particular baseline version of records of processing. So that's why it's extremely important not to be undermined. This is referred in Article 30 of GDPR. Consent, not a silver bullet. We've spoken in the session with Deepak and Trevor also a while ago. We said increasingly people are using consent as a silver bullet solution, assuming that a data subject has read and understood, and therefore there is no requirement for organization to be worried about what they can do and they can't do. But it's umpteen times proven in various occasions in various investigation reports that consent is very difficult to implement. You have to have it. The consent has to meet certain grounds of criteria, which is well articulated in GDPR and other places. GDPR, for instance, talk about consent has to be fair, it has to be informed, it has to be revocable. So all these terms look very simple, but they have profound meaning if one needs to understand. And when you strictly implement GDPR, you will figure out that consent is very difficult to use. You can rarely use consent. You can use consent, as Trevor also mentioned, but only in certain cases where the choice is really free. The choice is absolutely free and not imposed. The data subject and the entity which is taking data needs to be at the same pedestal platform. One cannot be superior, data subject cannot be inferior. So those aspects need to be kept in mind. And increasingly the focus is shifting towards harm. While consent is useful in certain cases, of course we need it, but organizations cannot use as an excuse. They need to make sure that the accountability is taken care of by the controller to see that the data is processed in a fair manner. What is fairness? This is a very vast subject, but the recitals in GDPR and many other EDPB guidance speaks volumes about it, and we should read about that. DP law is only one of the applicable regulations. So we often look at data protection law, but what we need to understand is typically when a country develops an omnibus law, or even if you look at United States where there's a patchwork, each state has its own law. Some of them are coming up with, some came up, and there are sector laws. The regulations are very diverse, and it is even in GDPR case, Europe, you not only look at GDPR, but you need to look at other regulations which apply along with GDPR. And GDPR has a provision to say that each member state can come out with their own regulations. For instance, if it comes to employment, there are employment regulations which apply, labor laws which will apply. You may have to involve Works Council. If it is telemarketing and email marketing, you have to look at, currently it is e-privacy directive, because e-privacy regulation didn't get passed after multiple attempts. So you look at e-privacy directive, which although it applies on member nations, but we directly use it and see and along with member nations laws on what is permitted, what is not permitted. So such aspects needs to be looked at, and there are a lot of aspects which are not even defined yet. For instance, can you, when we say fairness, can you use personal information of people to drive them towards or nudge them towards a certain desired behavior in order to get benefited by the entity which is collecting data? There is no regulation around that, and unfortunately, it may take a long time before the regulation will come. Can an insurance provider share the data with? Sorry, can you share with data with insurance provider, and can insurance company hike up the prices premium because they came to know that you fall into a high risk category due to your driving habits or your dietary habits? So is that data sharing permitted? Today, it is not, because logically we know that insurance is based on statistical concepts, which assumes that all of the people who fall under certain category are equally likely to fall sick or equally likely to commit a particular accident, and therefore you should not be using the data to derive and derive the premium amount unless the regulation shapes up, and of course with information. So today such areas are all gray, and we need to wait and see how it evolves. These today come into the domain of ethics and fairness, but we are sure some of the sectoral laws will catch up to define these. Innovation, in legal parlance, anything not prohibited by law is permitted. So it's important to understand that laws are always blacklisting. They are not whitelisting. The law says these are the things which you cannot do, you should not do. The law will not define for you what is the white space. The rest all is white space, and therefore you can expect innovation to continue. It's rightly so for the good of the society, and more so in the digital realm. And you will see that privacy professionals will have tough time the way the delicate balance between privacy and innovation and other aspects. We have to constantly keep ourselves abreast with the developments, understand how the AI and ML will affect us, how IoT is different from a traditional way of data collection, how devices will communicate, what are the new innovative risks, the new risks that we coming up, how is privacy in blockchain being taken care of. Blockchain is going to invade to many domains. So our role should be to be familiar with these technologies and make sure that we appreciate that innovation will continue. How do we balance between innovation and privacy? Privacy standards, I think Kai just spoke, we understand. So the question keeps coming, how is standardization important? Is it really another burden? Do we already have a regulation called GDPR or CCPA or LGPD, and do we want one more standard which will say that okay, every now and then we need to comply? So this is needs to be understood with a greater amount of maturity, particularly multinational companies which operate in several jurisdictions will be subjected to different laws. Although a good amount of data privacy laws have 80 to 90% commonality, it is the sustainability which makes it difficult to rely only on regulation, because as those of you who are in DPO and CPO will understand that the data privacy is not data privacy, data security, quality, all these domains, compliance domains are always against the business, in the sense that they will slow down the business if you overdo, or if you don't draw the lines carefully. And therefore, the rigor at which these things are achieved, the rigor comes down gradually as you go along, because of the effort involved and the cost involved. It's very important for us to see that the effort that we invested in terms of tool, the processes, etc., in the time of initial compliance exercise is sustained. And to sustain that, there is nothing better than standards, because standards, the advantage you get out of that is that they are recertifiable, they are subject to recertification, surveillance audits every 6 months, 1 year, 3 years, and that itself brings a rigor into the entire organization, and every function within the organization takes it seriously to see that there's expected certification which they have to prepare for. That's not me to say that you just prepare just before the certification, but you, through internal audit mechanisms, you'll continue to keep that going. And standards give you a perspective of a framework of best practices to base your entire PIMS on. So PIMS is Privacy Information Management System, or you call Personal Information Management System, equivalent of ISMS in 27001. This system people may develop in their own way. Even ISO 2770 gives the flexibility, but it is important to have this framework to see that no area is left and there's no stone unturned when it comes to the regulation. And it also brings the focus of continuous improvement, which is not necessarily specified in regulations. And why continuous improvement is required? Because the things change, because the regulations change, because you need to, we'll come to that a little later, privacy, you want to use it as differentiator, you want to satisfy the stakeholders, so there's a need for continuous improvement. DP professionals, should they be lawyers or should they be engineers, is a very, very difficult question to answer. It keeps coming in a debate that what kind of profession is the data privacy? Is it a techno-legal function? Is it a process legal function? And there's no right answer. Even GDPR and many regulations do not specify what the qualifications of a data privacy officer should be. They left it at saying that they need to be proficient in the field. So how do we then take a decision? So based on experience, we felt that it is a techno-legal function. Both lawyers and engineers are required because increasingly the data privacy function has become technical. To start with, maybe a decade ago, it started mostly under general counsels, and because it was a regulated trigger was there, and therefore people felt that it's best kept at legal under the legal function. But as technology evolved, there was a need to appreciate how the apps work, how the digital platforms work, and then apply the law. And that requires one to understand the nuances of the technology, the data flows, the way the consents are modular, all that requires how the algorithms work, how can you make algorithms transparent, how do you prevent opacity, how do you ensure accuracy of data, all that requires you to appreciate logic, statistics, and mathematics, and therefore I see that there's an increasing need of engineers. So it is not about lawyer or engineer. I would say that if you have lawyers, they need to learn technology. If they're technologists, they need to learn law. I would sum it up that way. Digital mirror, it's a concept I keep talking about. It is it's becoming important because a lot of intrusive tools are being developed across the world to monitor people, particularly in the pandemic time. There is a need to for employers to assess productivity. They would like to see that, hey, are my employees delivering enough? Should we keep the webcam on? Should we should we capture what they're doing every minute? Should we see what apps are open, how much time they're spending in which app? All that becomes important, particularly in certain types of work nature where you need to bill to the customer, and therefore customer has the right to know. But a lot of work is still the nature of job requires you to have autonomy a good amount of degree of autonomy to decide how you'll work, and you deliver a committed deliverable rather than requirement to monitor a person every hour. And therefore, what we felt through experience is that when you want to introduce such tools, the intent is going to be to help for people improve their productivity. It is enough to give them a reflection of their digital footprints for themselves to see and not somebody else to see. Just like you go into a mirror and see, you try different dresses, you different types of cosmetics you apply, etc., and choose what's best for you in the mirror. This digital mirror is kind of reflection of what you do in your computer in a day or in a week, and it tells you how much time you spent in what, and how much time you're looking at what, and possibly the way you type, the amount of time you take to type. All those aspects are fine as long as they are shown to you. So this itself helps you to reassess yourself at the end of the week or end of the month and say that where are the areas for improvement. But if the same is shared with the top management or the managers, it could lead to privacy violations, because you are intruding into people's autonomy to the way they want to work. So we are not today in a situation where we want to ask people every hour, every minute what you're doing, right? So that's why this very important concept I would like to emphasize. Compliance. Is compliance binary? Yes, it is binary. We to meet the board, every time board will say that are you compliant or not compliant. There is nothing like half compliance, 90% compliance, maybe not, is not accepted. So how do you handle this dichotomy? So compliance always remains like this. It is binary. However, fortunately, many aspects of the regulation are not prescriptive. They are they're a level where the controls that you implement could be different, and you can still achieve the compliance. Company A and company B could achieve differently the same compliance. And how do you then discount for the degree of non-compliance? You do a risk assessment and you say that we accept certain amount of risk, or we transfer certain amount of risk and in order to be compliant. Of course, you cannot take significant amount of risk and say that I'm compliant, but somewhere the risk assessment helps you to say that certain risks I can accept for the time being, or we keep trying to put mitigation measures which will improve over a period of time, and therefore we say that we are compliant. So that is how you need to handle. Otherwise, most organizations, you will find that they will have lots of non-compliances if they have to be really 100% compliant. And sometimes we even do we need to think about being over compliant? This is also a question that keeps coming. Should we be over compliant or should we be just compliant? So this will bring up to the question. It depends on your privacy strategy. Do you want to use data to make money? Do you have the requirement to see while compliant to the regulation, for instance, to privacy notices? Maybe in case of California, you can offer incentives. All that is fine as long as you are transparent. But in those cases, the risk needs to be decided based on to what extent it aligns with privacy strategy or not. The realm of privacy, public versus private bodies, as we know, data privacy applies in both public and private bodies. Even when we deal with private bodies, there are interactions with government bodies. There will be requests for data, and in those cases, there is certain countries the regulations do not stipulate the court order requirement for sharing data, but some of them do. It's very important for Data Privacy Office to consider those, weighing the risks of disclosure, data disclosures. We have seen Shen's case, etc. So to what extent you can share data depends on whether the law of the land will require court order or the regulator executive order is enough. But it's important to assess, and this big problem becomes more complex when the data subjects come from different countries. The law of multi countries apply. Those are the areas where this becomes a big issue. Lastly, we should use privacy as a differentiator as much as possible. Don't treat privacy as a compliance burden. If you convert it into a differentiator, you then satisfy the stakeholders. In fact, to delight them by understanding their expectations, keep them informed about the nature of privacy practices as much as possible, give them choice. So that way you not only comply to the regulation, but you also are one step ahead and making it a USP. And therefore, customers will like to come to you for buying the product. Of course, it will last for some time, but there will always be better ways to satisfy the customer. So that's what I would summarize this whole privacy in 10 years time. There are a lot more to learn, and we'll keep interacting in subsequent sessions. If you have time for a few questions, I'm not sure, Rajesh, if you have questions.
Thank you very much, Srini. Thank you very much, Srini, for a wonderful insight of your decade-long experience in your privacy domain. And I'm definitely sure that the participants who are listening to this, who are actually looking at this particular kind of domain as one of the career ambition and moving towards it on organizations, in that case, I'm sure this will definitely add on to its your 11 to 12 years of experience in privacy will definitely add to them to achieve their particular destiny. So thank you very much on this, and really great to have you here and providing your practical insights into what are some of the challenges and how as a DPO you were able to. And thank you. So there's no questions as such, but I can just once again check on the chat. But if there is anything,
I can understand it's quite late in India now, and it's the end of the day here. That's fine. I think we have covered most of it.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you all for the audiences who are there on the platform. We look forward for tomorrow for another set of round of three interesting sessions. And tomorrow we would also look at speakers who are primarily from and women in privacy, which we'll be celebrating across with eminent speakers across all the different sessions that will happen. So look forward to meet you tomorrow. Until then, take care, stay safe, and good evening, good night, and have a great day. Thank you.